Dr. Dan anxiously paced in his cell. It was the only way he'd been able to occupy himself for the past 6 months, save for poring through files and, when he was lucky, being able to oversee another failed termination attempt. He only stopped pacing when, for a brief and horrible moment, he realized that monster was probably doing the exact same thing in its big metal cube at this very moment. That horrible creature that he'd thrown away his life for a futile shot at killing. Perhaps the whole thing had been a fool's errand. After all, he was formerly a researcher under the employ of the SCP Foundation. Secure, contain, protect. They had truly sadistic beasts like SCP-106, the Nightmarish Old Man, and SCP-352 Baba Yaga in containment cells, and there was no plans to terminate either of them. They weren't the Global Occult Coalition for 343's sake. Why did Dr. Dan even want to terminate SCP-096 in the first place? He tried to explain it to them again and again, but his pleas had fallen on deaf ears. In his mind, the impetus for destroying the Shy Guy was terrifyingly clear. It was a monster that killed anyone or anything that looked at its face, even a photograph of it, even a tiny collection of pixels. When its rage state was induced, it seemed that nothing would stop it. It would have an intuitive psychic link to its victim, charge at them at breakneck speed, and only find its zen again once all of them were dead. And if a picture of SCP-096 was leaked onto the internet, it would cause a chain reaction that triggered an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. There were plenty of creatures and entities that the Foundation knew about that could theoretically bring about the apocalypse, but to him, 096 was the most realistic. It preyed upon the inherent curiosity and thirst for knowledge seated in every human heart. The same drive to simply know that led to the creation of the SCP Foundation would be humanity's doom in the face of an SCP-096 outbreak. And if such a thing happened, the Foundation would need to break the masquerade of secrecy to have any hope of saving humanity. In his many feverish nightmares, Dr. Dan had seen it all so clearly. The first photographs of SCP-096's face would be leaked online. Perhaps a few hundred people across the globe would look, in disparate enough locations that it would be almost impossible for the Foundation to detect and save all of them, as SCP-096 went on its bloody rampage. Of course, as the image proliferated, as images on the internet often do, the purview of 096's violence would only grow. People across the nation would start to take notice, and soon after that, across the world. Mysterious creature causing mass casualties would be the headline on every news desk, because why would anybody want to talk about anything else? Perhaps some foolish reporters would take video footage of the creature. Everyone has a phone these days with high-definition cameras. Pictures would be taken and posted. More and more of it would flood the internet. Too many simultaneous moles for even the SCP Foundation to whack. The news would spread. Panic and hysteria would spread. People wouldn't even know what's triggering all this horror if the Foundation didn't go public and tell them that it was the pictures that was killing everyone. And by then, wouldn't it already be too late? The antidote to fear is knowledge. It's why when anything goes wrong, we're refreshing timelines and feeds and news websites for any kind of information. And if you were told an unstoppable monster was killing scores of people and might be coming to a neighborhood near you sometime soon, wouldn't you want a good look at it? Wouldn't you want to know your enemy? Having no idea that the mere act of knowing was what sealed your horrible fate. By Dr. Dan's bleak estimations, if only several million people died as a result of this kind of scenario, it could be considered a positive outcome. He'd seen it all, but no matter how many times he tried to articulate this to his superiors, he wasn't listened to. They didn't take him or the threat that SCP-096 posed seriously. Every time he warned of the apocalyptic potential of SCP-096, he was simply told to get back to working on those goggles. It was why he needed to give those naysayers a demonstration. It was why a certain photograph needed to show up in the home of a certain mountaineer. It's why all those people had to die. There was no other way. The deaths of the civilians and the researchers and the Mobile Task Force members were, of course, regrettable. but it was the only way to prevent the deaths of so many more. They gave him what he wanted: permission to put this gangly time bomb in the ground, even if the beast's death was inextricably tied to his own execution at the hands of the very employers who authorized him. The world was full of funny little ironies like that. Another one is that even though Dr. Dan now had the authorization and funding to terminate SCP-096, he was discovering that he lacked another important factor: the capability. They tried incinerating it, exposing it to massive amounts of radiation, exposing it to an insane degree of kinetic trauma, the equivalent of being hit by an out-of-control bullet train. They tested every kind of experimental, off-the-books weaponry that they had access to through various research projects. Proton blasts, lasers, high-intensity energy beams. Nothing. Even when they fried off every scrap of flesh on the monster's body, its unbreakable skeleton still remained, and in what seemed like no time at all, it'd be back in action. Its very existence seemed to mock him. A guard opened his cell door, staring disdainfully at the disgraced researcher. That same guard had slammed his head against a wall a month earlier. One of his friends had apparently been killed in the legendary 096 containment breach that set this whole sordid thing in motion. "Up and at 'em, scumbag," he said in a gruff, surly voice, training a handgun on the doctor he knew wouldn't fight back. "They need you in test chamber 6. Dr. Dan allowed himself a small grin, imperceptible to the guard who clearly hated his guts. They'd approved his 096 versus 682 cross-test. Marvelous. How marvelous. To all the others, it would seem like just one more entry in a long line of 682 cross-tests. He thought it darkly funny. In his eyes, the Foundation had no hope of ever killing SCP-682. Its defining quality was being impossible to kill, and it didn't present nearly the threat to the entire world that 096 posed. Their futile attempts to murder the lizard were little more than a money sink to justify the site's exorbitant funding. But perhaps he could turn this to his benefit. Maybe SCP-682 would hold the secret to actually killing off his nemesis. Within 30 hours, Dr. Dan had his disappointing answer. Both anomalies had undeniably done a real number on each other, and Dr. Dan did take a kind of sick amusement in the mental trauma that SCP-682 had induced in 096. But ultimately, it was all for nothing. 682 had skinned 096 alive and melted off its flesh with acid, but once again, that indestructible skeleton stood firm. This had been the 27th termination attempt since the incident. The 27th failed termination attempt, Dr. Dan mentally corrected himself. 096's skeleton kept defeating them. Even their most ardent attempts to penetrate the bones and destroy the creature within had failed. During a previous attempt, they tried to access the brain by putting a diamond-hard drill into its eye sockets. Of course, it was the drill that actually broke, much to Dr. Dan's seemingly tireless frustration. Needless to say, in the debriefing interview with Dr. Carver, a researcher who once would have considered him a colleague, he wasn't in high spirits. If he managed to kill this thing, then he would always be the hero who made a terrible sacrifice in order to save many more lives. If he didn't kill 096, he was little more than the monster who murdered all those innocent people for nothing. Though you'd never hear him say it out loud. If it wasn't for that damnable, indestructible skeleton, this monster would be long dead already. If only there was some way to break the creature's bones. That's when it hit him. SCP-173, the sculpture. A Site-19 icon often overlooked because of its more silent but deadly style, but undeniably one of the most frightening and dangerous anomalies out there. It had racked up a truly shocking body count since it was first interred at Site-19 in 1993, one broken neck at a time, and it's one of the few creatures out there that even the hard-to-destroy reptile himself is utterly terrified of. Perhaps a monster that practically has a PhD in breaking bones would be the ideal candidate to vandalize the Shy Guy's vertebrae. Once his proposal was greenlit for initial testing, Dr. Dan arranged for the Shy Guy, with a bag over his head of course, to be brought into a testing chamber with the ever-stoic SCP-173. When all of the researchers and guards were safely outside, all it took was a single blink to make all of Dr. Dan's darkest dreams come true. In the nanoseconds his eyes were closed, he heard the most beautiful sounds in the world. A loud, fleshy crunch and a pained howl from 096. He opened his eyes to an equally wondrous sight. 096 doubled over at an unnatural angle. Its spine snapped between the fourth and fifth vertebrae, spinal fluid leaking down the creature's flank. That freaky little sculpture had done it. It had actually damaged the integrity of the Shy Guy's skeleton. It was at that moment that Dr. Dan knew he could kill this thing. Admittedly, there was a containment breach shortly after that when the bag slipped off of 096's head, and it charged through the nearby steel wall, killing multiple people before being subdued and recontained. But when it comes to projects involving Dr. Dan, a mere handful of innocent people being killed sits comfortably within the acceptable margin of error. A day later, Dr. Dan was standing before a crowded boardroom, with agents, researchers, and even a few members of the O5 Council in attendance. He explained his findings to them, and the fact that, even more importantly, they may have a way to bring the wretched existence of 096 to an absolute halt. His plans were approved. Not long after, he was putting them into motion. Dr. Dan was surrounded by researchers and heavily armed guards as 173 was escorted into the test chamber with a forklift. 096 was there, still bagged. Off to the side was a giant tub of hydrofluoric acid connected to a hose and injector attachment. If this didn't work, nothing would. Everyone stood back in a safe zone as 173 was released to do its thing. Crunch. Just like the previous time, 096's spine had been successfully snapped. Spinal fluid dribbled down its skin. Everyone had rushed into the chamber. One group kept 173 isolated with their stares. The other, headed by Dr. Dan, prepared the acid injector and shoved it into the breach in 096's spine. As the acid was pumped by the gallon into 096's bones, the creature let out the most horrifying wail. It kicked and bucked as more acid was pumped in, melting those indestructible bones from within. The creature even began to vomit acid as it panicked, melting the bag off of its own head. Some panicked and averted their gaze. Dr. Dan didn't. He stared directly at the creature's face for the first time as it melted in front of him with nothing short of pure elation. Had he won? Had he actually won? The creature let out a gurgling shriek and the guards opened fire. Their bullets splattered into the monster's melting flesh and bones as it hollered and shrieked. They didn't let up, firing up and down its body, spraying it with white-hot lead. It began to melt and bubble away, expanding into a great, gruesome puddle on the floor beneath them. Dr. Dan laughed like a madman. Even as the guards grabbed him and dragged him away from the foul-smelling, greasy mess, bubbling with chemical life, he just kept laughing. Even though he knew the death of 096 meant an equally swift death of his own, it didn't matter. It had all been for something. The world was saved. It was over. He'd finally won. Now,
please, good sir, I beseech you, as a man of science, nay, as a man of reason, you mustn't stifle my research at this critical juncture. You have no idea how close I am to finding a cure for this blasted pestilence. I need only a handful of live subjects to complete my research.
The plague doctor's emphatic pleas fell on deaf ears, as a stone-faced researcher took notes on his latest pontifications. The doctor, whom these clods had reduced so rudely to a mere number, SCP-049, banged his gloved fist up against the wall. And to think he once thought of these men as intellectual equals, fellow travelers on the road to scientific enlightenment. What a positively sick joke. Before the doctor got another chance to appeal for his right to experiment, the researcher left him alone once more. A truly sad state of affairs. Nobody appreciated a true scientist in this day and age. It was sure to be another day of languishing alone in his cell, wishing he had the capacity to do more. So he was surprised as anyone when the alarm started going off, and the door of his cell swung open automatically. The Plague Doctor stepped out of his cell and into the hall, where many other humanoid anomalies were roaming, confused as to why they'd been suddenly released. What was happening? As it turned out, what was happening was one of the most brutal Chaos Insurgency raids the staff of Site-19 had ever seen. It had been planned immaculately. You see, guards rotate semi-regularly at Site-19 due to the high-pressure nature of the job. Lots of deaths and mental breakdowns, as you probably correctly predicted. Even the administrative staff of the SCP Foundation are only human. Well, mostly anyway. So they're not immune to little oversights here and there. And it's in those oversights that expertly trained Chaos Insurgency infiltration agents make their living. No less than 15 of them had been working undercover in Site-19 for just over 2 weeks, and they did a fine job of lowering the metaphorical drawbridge for a heavily armed invasion force. The guards who weren't plants were quickly murdered by the infiltrators, and even some of the on-site task forces were quickly overwhelmed and gunned down by the high-precision rifles of the Chaos Insurgency's finest. While the frontliners were distracted by the sudden assault, the infiltrators found their way to the site's security control room and massacred everyone inside. Opening every single door in the site was as simple as putting in a few stolen key codes and flipping a few carefully remembered switches. Consequently, while Foundation agents and Chaos Insurgency mercenaries clashed sabers, high-priority anomalies like SCP-049 simply wandered the facility, watching the calamity unfold within. The Foundation was beset on all sides, shot at by heavily armed maniacs, and attacked from within by the numerous roaming anomalous entities that were eager to get their hands on Foundation personnel. Definitely not an ideal situation, to say the least. The Plague Doctor only had one thing on his mind, though.
This definitely won't do my research any good, unless I can escape and find my way to a suitable laboratory. Oh, now there's an idea.
But his scientific fantasies were soon interrupted by a Chaos Insurgency soldier swinging the butt of his M4 carbine into his avian exoskull with a supremely unpleasant crack. The doctor was dazed by it momentarily, the pain coming at him like a thunderclap, but the insurgent never got the chance to take another swing. Before the insurgent could do anything, the Plague Doctor lunged out with practiced speed, grasping him by the throat. Immediately, everything went black, and the insurgent's limp corpse collapsed to the ground.
Serves him right,
the doctor internally mused.
Soldiers attacking medics is violating even the most basic rules of gentlemanly warfare.
Then another flash of immense pain, as a different rifle butt collided with the back of his head. The doctor fell to one knee, feeling dizzy, but before he could retaliate, he felt the 2 sharp prongs of a cattle prod pressing up against his neck. The sudden rush of electricity surged through his neck, sending his muscles into a wave of involuntary spasms. The insurgents crowding around him chimed in with their own agonizing cattle prods, relentlessly shocking him until the flashes of white-hot pain soon became an oppressive blanket of total dark. Even on his most cantankerous days, the SCP Foundation had never treated him like this. When he eventually came to, he was still in darkness, standing upright, with high-tech shackles holding every limb in place. It was beyond uncomfortable for the poor Plague Doctor, but it succeeded in the task of keeping him under control. He couldn't move an inch. There were muffled voices beyond the dark, beyond the confines of this new containment. The modulated gas mask voices of insurgents and something else, faintly accented, oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Soon the voices were replaced by another sound, the grinding of crowbars levering nails out of cheap wood. With a creaking tumble, a rectangle of bright light opened up in front of him, populated by a number of silhouettes. On either side were Chaos Insurgents in familiar tactical garb, and in between them stood a tall, well-groomed man with an expensive-looking purple smoking jacket and a pencil mustache. For a few fractions of a second, his face was a portrait of excitement. But as he took in the sight of the Plague Doctor standing before him, all the joy drained from his snooty countenance.
What the hell am I looking at here?
The man in the smoking jacket said. The doctor, indignant at such a response from the man who'd presumably ordered his assault, rasped,
A man of science, good sir.
The man in the smoking jacket ignored him and continued to berate the Chaos Insurgents, with an odd level of confidence for someone reprimanding trained, cold-blooded killers.
I wanted SCP-650, the startling statue, not this clownish Ren Fair cosplayer. What the hell did I pay you ruffians for? I was told you Chaos Insurgents were the very best at this, and for your hefty price, I expect excellence.
The rant continued much like this, leaving everyone in attendance, the insurgents, the plague doctor, feeling thoroughly exhausted by him and unable to do anything about it. You see, this wasn't just any Chaos Insurgency client, your average tin pot dictator or arms dealer. You know the type. This was the one and only Pascal Leggett, one of the most famous, or rather infamous, anart collectors in the game. He'd been a founding person of interest for years due to his dealings with the Chaos Insurgency and Marshall Carter and Dark Limited, all to the end of expanding his anart collection, but his vast wealth and connections had always shielded him from Foundation probes. For those unfamiliar with the subculture, anart, short for anomalous art, is exactly what it sounds like. Artistic projects with anomalous properties to give it that extra kick. One of the most popular groups of interest dealing in anart is the iconic Are We Cool Yet?, which incidentally had recently excommunicated Pascal Leggett for being an exceedingly wealthy, uptight square who really didn't represent the collective's rebellious ethos. And considering his response was to pay the Chaos Insurgency to raid Site-19 for a few pieces for his own private collection, costing him millions of dollars and both groups many lives, it was safe to say he wasn't taking it well.
Look, we got you that other statue and that thing killed 4 of our best guys, so how about we just call it even? Said one of the insurgents. I'm sure you can have fun with bird brain here too.
Pascal tutted and reluctantly dismissed the hired guns. Having the Plague Doctor here definitely wasn't ideal, especially considering he wanted to host the ultimate anart exhibition to put Are We Cool Yet worthless Sommes-nous devenus magnifiques to shame. But he would make do with what he had. Perhaps he could say that 049 was a commentary on the ever-present nature of disease in mankind's life, and our forever archaic approach to it.
Yes, that would do nicely.
Needless to say, the Plague Doctor was infuriated by all this. The violence against his person, the kidnapping, the disrespect, and most of all, the interruption to his precious research, especially considering how close he'd gotten to finding a cure for the pestilence. But instead, he was soon spirited by a legion of heavily armed goons from his wooden box to a glass one in one of Leggett's many opulent hallways. There were other glass cases on either side of him, and more on the other side of the hall, all too reinforced for the Plague Doctor to even smash through it on his own. Damn it. Leggett's own private anart exhibition, probably wedged between his oversized dining room and his jewel-encrusted crapper. Occasionally, Pascal himself would jaunt down the hallway to gaze upon his new stolen anart pieces, and of course the Plague Doctor would try his best to reason with him.
I am a patient man, Monsieur Leggett, but this is simply barbaric. By what right do you imprison me here? Is your intention to deprive the world, the entire human race, of my valuable medical breakthroughs? Could you live with that on your conscience, good sir?
There was never any meaningful response. The Plague Doctor soon learned that Pascal Leggett didn't like his art interactive. It was simply meant to languish away in a glass box, being watched, being passively looked at. Those Chaos Insurgency louts hadn't even bothered to bring his notebook or medical bag, so he was without the tools to even perform his experiments. As loathed as he was to admit it, this was even worse than being mocked up by the SCP Foundation. But all this wasn't entirely unfamiliar. There was something in the glass box across from the Plague Doctor that he vaguely recognized back from Site-19. He'd never seen it up close, but he'd heard researchers speaking about it, and even seen a few pictures. And such a strange construction it was. A peculiar, haphazard sculpture made from concrete, rebar, and spray paint. Quite ugly, in this humble doctor's opinion, but there was something oddly entrancing about it. And for reasons beyond the doctor's recollection, 4 of Leggett's men stood around the glass box in where it was being stored, always watching. The men were frequently switched in and out, as though they were watching in shifts, always fixing their gaze on its peculiar, malformed body. Maybe it was all the electrical shocks and knocks to the head, but he just couldn't remember why Pascal was having the piece so carefully observed. But he knew on some primal level that the secret to this would perhaps be the key to his own escape. If only he could remember. Still, time passed. Pascal drifted in and out, sometimes with guests. The Plague Doctor had learned not to speak. These animals could not be reasoned with. As a scientist, he would instead carefully observe until his observations bore fruit. He noticed that Pascal's guests, all people who looked equally as wealthy and pompous as Pascal himself, all seemed to look right over him, and instead focus on the ugly statue across the hall, still forever observed by any 4 of Pascal's men. Some of them looked actively nervous, just being in its presence. Curious, the Plague Doctor made a mental note of this, just as he did when Pascal gave his guests a reassuring pat on the shoulder and told them,
"Please calm yourself. It's harmless while my personnel are keeping an eye on it."
Little by little, the Plague Doctor's memories of his infamous neighbor had begun to return. He knew what he must do to escape. Now all he needed to do was wait for the perfect moment. Soon enough, Pascal's mansion was filled with a bevy of Anart snobs from hither and yon, a private soiree to show off his new collection. They wandered the halls in 3-piece tuxedos and designer ballroom dresses, sipping champagne from imported crystal. All such lovely, refined, high society people, and if the good doctor's plan went off as he intended, they would all be such lovely, refined, high society corpses. The Plague Doctor waited until, mercifully, he and the 4 members of personnel watching the sculpture were the only ones left in the hallway. He'd been so good, so patient, that none of the men guarding the sculpture at present had ever heard him make a noise. He was so invisible to them that, in all likelihood, they probably didn't even notice he could make a sound. And that worked for his purposes just fine. Though in any case, if he wanted this to work, he would need to time his plan perfectly. Even a fraction of a second out of place and the whole thing would have dire consequences. Still, the Doctor was still a Frenchman at heart, and as a Frenchman, he knew he would rather die nobly in the process of escape than remain captured by this worthless buffoon. He'd be sure to take as many of these men down with him in the process as he was able. The Plague Doctor exhaled deeply, drawing a lungful of air, then bellowed as loud as he possibly could. The sudden, unexpected noise was so shocking that it jogged the 4 watchers almost reflexively to turn and look at him, and in the split second that they did, the Plague Doctor closed his eyes. In the dark, time seemed to move slower, perhaps due to the Doctor's keen focus, cultivated over many a century. He listened carefully to the sequence of sounds: glass shattering, 4 choked gasps in sequence, 4 brutal crunches, then nanoseconds later, more glass shattering. The Plague Doctor's eyes snapped open just in time. Just as predicted, the sculpture, being entirely unobserved, had smashed through its glass case, murdering all 4 members of personnel by snapping their necks, and then smashed through his own glass case to do the same to him. The Plague Doctor had cut it so close, in fact, that he opened his eyes to the face of the sculpture staring into his own, its concrete limbs wrapped around his neck. Very good timing indeed. With a sigh of relief, the Plague Doctor slipped out of the sculpture's concrete grasp and back down the hallway, keeping his gaze fixed on the sculpture the entire time. He'd heard it decimate Pascal's men. He certainly didn't fancy undergoing the same fate. The second the Plague Doctor backed around the corner, rendering the sculpture, or as the SCP Foundation called it, SCP-173 out of sight, he could hear terrified screaming coming from the other end of the hall. He was not a sadistic man, but the Plague Doctor would be lying if he told you he didn't take just a little bit of pleasure in hearing that sound. Somewhere else in the vast mansion of Pascal Leggett, the sculpture was slaughtering its way through servants and party guests, while the Plague Doctor searched for some kind of exit. Anyone who dared get in his way was given a swift and merciless touch of death, sending their body unceremoniously to the ground. Anyone in his way was preventing him from finding a cure for the pestilence, and thus endangering countless lives. It was, of course, regrettable to have to kill anyone, but some sacrifices must be made for the greater good of mankind. Well, it's not necessarily always regrettable per se. On his way out, while the murderous rampage of SCP-173 seemed to distract anyone of note, the Plague Doctor just so happened to encounter a fleeing Pascal Leggett, hoping to find some kind of escape himself. It seemed that now fate was on his side once more. To have his jailer right here in the palm of his hand would be such a perfect parting gift. Funnily enough, Pascal was far more talkative to him now. He rattled off a rapid-fire series of threats, bribes, and pleas, claiming in the end that he never meant any harm. He was the one who freed the Plague Doctor from the SCP Foundation. They were on the same side here. All this was for the art. No offense was ever intended. Pascal Leggett simply lived for art.
Then die for it, good sir,
the plague doctor said. And with a single touch, Pascal's eyes rolled up into the back of his head, and he fell to the ground, dead. It was one of the few non-scientific deaths that he felt truly no guilt for. After some time searching, the screams around the rest of the mansion eventually went silent. That did wonders for his focus. It didn't take long for the plague doctor to locate an exit, a fine mahogany door with elaborate adornments befitting a man as gaudy as Pascal, and began strolling towards it, his chest swollen with pride and a sense of accomplishment. Then he blinked, and a few feet in front of him stood the sculpture. It was there so suddenly that the plague doctor fell backwards in shock, but he devoted everything to keeping an eye on that monstrosity. With everyone else in the mansion presumably dead at this point, it had now come back for him. It stood there staring silently, ready to exact the terrible price for freeing it as soon as the doctor dared to blink. The plague doctor began crawling backwards down the hall, just wanting to put some distance between himself and the sculpture. As the seconds passed, he could feel his eyes drying out until the inevitable blink. The sculpture was standing right in front of him now, gazing down, almost mocking. It had closed the distance so quickly. If the plague doctor blinked again, he was sure that his eyes would never open again. All it had to do was wait as the seconds passed, and the doctor began to feel his eyes drying up again. That subtle sting quickly grew into a nagging pain that could not be denied. Sooner or later, he was going to have to. Bang! The front door flew open, and in an instant the hallway was filled with heavily armed troops, all wearing the familiar black and gray of the SCP Foundation. The plague doctor had never been so relieved to see the organization that had kept him locked up for so many decades. For once they'd saved him from something even worse. Of course, the sculpture didn't say anything, but the disappointment of losing that one more victim seemed to radiate off of it like a lingering bad smell. The plague doctor willingly gave himself up, and heavy machinery was brought in to pick up SCP-173, with the help of the iPods to make sure it didn't try any funny business in transit. Pascal had gotten away with his shady dealings for years, but the brazen attack he funded against Site-19 was now enough for the Foundation to track him down. When his corpse was found in the halls of his own home with no obvious cause of death, we can happily tell you that nobody was disappointed. By the evening, the plague doctor was happy to be back in his cell. His research could continue here, and in time he knew that the personnel of the SCP Foundation would listen to reason and comply with his demands. After all, science marches on, regardless of who chooses to march with it. But he would forever feel a little nervous in Site-19 after that, knowing the concrete monster he was sharing the building with. He hoped that if ever there was another containment breach involving that thing, that it didn't feel like paying him a visit for old time's sake. A very strange anomaly sits in a humanoid containment cell in the minimum security wing of Site-17. He walks, talks, and looks like a man, but everything else is convoluted in a question mark. This is SCP-343, who, like his namesake, God, is likely to cause arguments whenever he's brought up. Is he the creator of all that exists, the basis for the Abrahamic faiths, or is he a pretender, a reality warper with immense power and predilection towards delusion, a courtesian of the house of Maladrog, Matthew, Methuselah, Yahweh? Who knows? Really, it depends on who you ask, and which stories you choose to believe. And few people enjoy a good story more than SCP-343 himself. If one day you take the time to visit him in his room and ask him to reveal a page in the long book of his personal history, he might be kind enough to tell you a story. A story like this, of an encounter with something monstrous that few others could hope to survive meeting face to face. Rewind a few thousand years. Nobody knows how many exactly. God, as he chooses to dub himself, walked across the cracked ground on worn sandals. It'd been some time since he'd seen an animal around here, and even longer since he'd seen a human being. Not that this bothered him. He'd never been bothered by his own company on a long walk like this. Of course, he could have sped up time or teleported, but where was the fun in that? He was a tourist in the world of sensation, of experience, of flesh, bone, dirt, blood, and sand. After all, where's the fun in creating a whole universe if you can't drop in now and then to visit and do as the Romans do? Not that the Romans would be around for another few thousand years, Even Atlas must occasionally shift the weight of the globe from his shoulders for a jaunt around the cosmic neighborhood and whatever passes for fresh air in the vacuum. God whistled a tune to himself. It was a craggy, mountainous region he'd found himself in. The distant peaks had frosted caps, a breathtaking place where many truly had their breaths taken away. How humans will so happily risk their lives to do something extraordinary. It never ceased to amaze him. His stomach rumbled. Oh, how he enjoyed that sensation. One of the funny little quirks of this human form that he weaved for himself. It was no reason to be concerned, if memory served, from his last trip through the area a few decades before. There was a friendly village not far from here. They had always accepted him as a genial stranger, having no knowledge of his true power. God had always believed that a person's goodness is defined by how they treat those from whom they had nothing to gain. So it caused him great concern as he approached the village and saw great plumes of smoke rising into the sky. He was so shocked by this that he could decide to break his rule about walking as a man, in case there was still some way he could help. With a snap of his fingers, he disappeared and reappeared in the center of the village's town square. Total devastation. Huts and houses had been torn asunder. Broken weapons lay on the ground. Some places were on fire, others smeared with streaks of blood, like some terrible battle had occurred here. But something was wrong. No bodies, not one, from defender or assailant. How could a thriving village be so thoroughly destroyed and not leave a single corpse? It was an act so bizarre and depraved that it left even God puzzling. That was another downside of his human form. Here on Earth, he didn't have access to true omniscience. How could a mere human mind, bound by the constraints of linear time, ever truly comprehend the total of existence? Even attempting to do that here would melt the brain of his human body in its skull and leave it dribbling out of his nose and ears. Instead, he chose to walk around the ruins of the village and investigate firsthand. Arrows and broken spears and swords littered the ground. Some buildings were demolished, but there were no tracks or stray projectiles that could suggest the presence of siege weapons. No, these buildings looked like they were ripped apart. Some even still had claw marks. What terrible beast could have set upon this town and done this? Then he heard a voice, quiet and pleading, beneath some nearby rubble. A survivor. He rushed over to the pile and evaporated it with a thought. Underneath, a feeble old man, covered in stone dust, was quivering. God helped him up and guided him into one of the few remaining huts still standing in the village. They both took seats. God held up two hands, cradling empty space. Two cups suddenly occupied that space, both filled with warm, healing tea. He passed the old man one of the cups while sipping from his own. He asked the old man if he'd seen what had happened. The old man told him no, he hadn't seen anything in decades. He'd been rendered blind in his youth. Little did either of them know that very blindness was the only reason he was the sole survivor of the massacre. The blind man told God that one of the village's scouts had gone up into the mountain with a small hunting party. The group was gone for days, until one of the members, the youngest among them, returned weeping, frostbitten, and covered in blood. He said that his friends had been killed by a beast in the mountains, something that almost looked like a man, but terribly wrong. And its face, its awful, awful face. He would never forget it. He was just lucky to escape with his life when the others were torn apart. But when the young man returned, he'd brought the shadow of death with him. It was a curse that doomed the entire village, men, women, and children, to a terrible fate. And that fate was upon them a mere hour after the survivor had returned. Of course, there were gaps in the blind man's understanding, given he was lacking one of his major senses, but the sounds he could describe with perfect clarity. It was faint and distant at first, that awful wail, and the galloping, hands and feet thundering against the ground faster than any horse could move, getting closer and closer. Another villager saw it approaching and screamed. Then it was upon them. The villager screamed, but it screamed louder, always wailing and shrieking and sobbing like a monster crawling straight up from hell. People tried to fight it by the sounds of it. The blind man, with teary, blank eyes, recalled the sounds of arrows knocking and swords clashing against something. But even their greatest warriors had screamed and died. Those who saw it and tried to flee and hide were slaughtered all the same. Soon enough, there were only two sounds left in the village: the monster and the blind man, both weeping. He didn't understand why it never took him. It wasn't fair. It took everything else. To leave him here alive when everyone and everything he'd ever known was destroyed was a greater punishment than even death. After killing all of these innocents, the monster had simply wandered off to the mountains again, the sound of its quiet sobs getting smaller and smaller until it was gone altogether. God comforted the blind man as he wept for the loss of all his loved ones. He told the blind man that he would venture up to the mountains himself and confront the creature on its own territory, and at the very least, find out why it had done this terrible thing. But first, he must relocate the blind man to a safer place. He placed a hand on the blind man's shoulder and he vanished. He would appear in another friendly village, miles away. God sent a silent message into the minds of every villager.
Take good care of this man. He has undergone horrors you can't even imagine. Your kindness will be rewarded later. For that, you have my promise.
God sighed and turned his tired eyes to the distant mountains. A monster lurked up there, perhaps one of his own creations, or maybe a corruption of one of his creations. Either way, whatever existed without his knowledge existed without his consent, and he intended to know of the beast in the mountains. Though given what he'd seen already, he didn't expect to receive a warm welcome from this murderous demon. Miles away up in the mountains, the creature licked the blood from its cracked lips. It looked like it might have once been a human being or something that aspired to humanity or mocked it with its very existence. It was a huge, gangling beast, skin alabaster, eyes empty and soulless, dribbling rivulets of burning tears down a hideous, gaunt face. It crawled into the frozen mouth of a cave with great icicle fangs, wheezing and weeping. All it ever wanted was to be alone. Why did they have to keep interfering? Didn't they know what happened? All the terrible things they made it do. The creature curled its long, gangly body into the fetal position, scratching great ruts into the sides of its bald cranium with long, sharp fingers. Terrible things. Terrible, terrible things. And then there was a brilliant flash just a few feet away. The monster was surprised. It turned to see a figure silhouetted in the mouth of the cave. He wore sandals and thin robes. His eyes glowed with a kind of power that the monster didn't recognize. This stranger stared at the monster without an ounce of fear in his heart. He stared right into its eyes, unwavering. No, 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 no! It could feel it again, the rage bubbling up deep down. A cauldron of seething anger. It hated the feeling like being lowered into a vat of molten metal. Unspeakable fire and pain coursing through every vessel. It began to weep and scream while the stranger in the cave mouth just watched, not moving a muscle.
Do you know who I am?
The stranger asked with a deep voice that betrayed almost infinite power, knowledge, and wisdom. But it wouldn't change the outcome here. The monster bounded at him at speeds that wouldn't be seen again until jet planes and bullet trains are invented millennia into the future. Its jaws were hanging impossibly wide, fangs borne, its arms extended, and deadly claws ready to strike. But before those terrible hands could close around the stranger, he vanished. The monster stumbled and rolled across the snow, confused. What trickery was being used here?
I'll take that as a no,
said the voice from behind him.
You ought to show your father some respect. More respect than you gave to those poor people down in the village, at least.
Seething, the creature turned and saw the stranger standing back in the darkness of the cave, staring at him. But the beast didn't have the capacity for awe or holy terror, only violence. Boundless, limitless, unstoppable violence. It darted towards the stranger again, trying to strike him. Somehow it was like fighting an empty robe. Not a single one of its deadly strikes seemed to hit the stranger. The stranger leaped backwards, putting some space between himself and the monster, but still not breaking a sweat. He breathed in deeply, then exhaled. The breath came out like a mighty typhoon, shocking even the monster with its sudden force. It was blown backwards, a leaf in the wind, until its long claws dug into the ground and anchored it in place. The stranger gave a wry smile at this, impressed.
My, you're certainly a tenacious one, aren't you?
He said.
Perhaps we can talk for a little while instead of fighting. I want to know why you killed all those people.
No answer. The beast roared, its mighty limbs pounding into the ground as it closed the gap between itself and the stranger in fractions of a second. It would kill him, rend him, destroy him just like all the others. He'd left it no choice. Suddenly, the ground below it seemed to give way. The creature was confused. It looked down to see that the ancient stone below had somehow taken on the properties of a liquid, and it was sinking. The beast panicked and it began to thrash. It was a strong swimmer, but it didn't expect to need to swim here. The shock was too much, and soon the ground submerged it entirely, muffling its terrible roars and shrieks. And just like that, the ground was solid again, trapping the beast inside. The stranger stepped forward and looked at the ground.
A much-needed timeout,
he said.
You do yourself no good struggling like this.
Despite its terrible capacity for evil, God couldn't help but admire the beast, at least on the level of construction. It was so pared down, so unburdened. A killer to the core, but seemingly unkillable. Had he made this creature? Billions of species, and the species those in turn had created through billions of years of breeding and evolution. And somewhere along the line, this thing happened. It was easy even for the universe's creator to lose track of some of the tinier variables. And in the grand scheme of things, even this monster was still a tiny variable. But right here, right now, it was still one hell of a problem. The ground rumbled below God. Cracks formed. The mountain peak shook. God raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed, as the monster ripped free of its stone prison and re-entered the fray. It roared and screamed still, its blank eyes fixed on him. Its skeletal body throbbed and heaved with power. Unlike any other creature in nature, it was almost like the longer their conflict went on, the more energized the beast became. God sighed. All those poor villagers. They never stood a chance against this monster. It lunged for him, even faster and stronger than before. He teleported out of the way in the nick of time, and the beast's claws cleaved through a nearby cave wall, effortless. God materialized nearby, but he didn't have time to speak. The beast lunged again and again and again. Every time he reappeared, the beast went for him with impossible speed. Deciding to widen the playing field, God teleported to the top of the mountain. The creature, somehow sensing his presence, vaulted upwards and tunneled through the roof of the cave, bursting out of the ground in front of God, who was floating just slightly off the ground.
It would be wise of you to stop,
God carefully intoned.
All this time, I've been going easy on you. You don't want to find out what the wrath of God looks like.
Storm clouds were gathering above. Mighty thunder roared across the sky. The beast was undeterred. It roared and galloped towards God, and God, in turn, called down a response. A volley of lightning, the likes of which the world has never seen before or since, struck down on the charging monster. The sudden white flash could sting the eyes from miles away. The monster shrieked from the blast, feeling its flesh lift off its bones and atomize in the sheer heat of the electricity around it. It could smell itself cooking. The lightning blast only lasted for a few seconds, but for the beast, it felt like eternity. When the onslaught stopped, the air was still heavy with electrical potential. God stared down at the black scorch mark on the side of the mountain where the creature had been standing. All the snow within a mile had been evaporated by the blast. It was a raw display of the power of nature that would make even Zeus tremble in his sandals. And yet, there was still movement. Something started to get up from the burnt patch where nothing should be left alive. A blackened skeleton, rising shakily from the ash, but still very much alive. As it started to rise, new flesh began growing over its bones little by little. Even God was astonished by the sight of it. He'd never seen a creature cling so ardently to life in spite of having truly unsurmountable power amassed against it. It was up against God, and still, it fought. The monster tottered on its freakishly long limbs, still disoriented, unusually staggered for a creature driven by such single-minded violent purpose. When enough of its face grew back to do so, it began to weep and sob again, tears streaking down its terrible face. Looking at this creature after all of this, God couldn't help but feel a new emotion, pity. He lowered himself to the ground and approached the creature, like none had ever done before. He gathered it up into his arms and he held it, feeling its heaving, wretched sobs against him. The beast was in so much pain, he could feel it, radiating from within.
"Speak, my son,"
God said in a soft, fatherly voice. And for the first and only time, the monster spoke.
Can look, can see. Make me hurt people. Don't want hurt people. Can look, please.
That was all it managed to choke out before devolving back into unintelligible babble. But it was enough. Enough for God to understand its pain. He did not know if it would be right to change the monster's nature. Is it ever right to truly change anyone's nature? But it was within his almost limitless power to grant it one reprieve from pain. He settled the beast in the snow below him. It was quiet and still. And God said unto the beast,
"Rest now, child. Rest for thousands of years if you must. I hope only that when you eventually awaken, you feel differently."
And so another story from the catalog of SCP-343. Of course, it leaves us with certain questions, chief among them being, is it true? Did 343 and 096 have this chance encounter long ago? Or is this just another tall tale from an anomaly who fancies himself a deity? We have our truth, and you have yours. Let us know what you believe down below in the comments. Having your ordinary life unceremoniously change forever without a moment's notice is something that people can often find themselves hoping for. Anything to break life's monotony and change circumstances to make them more interesting. Although when that change comes in the form of being trapped in an endless IKEA outlet, it's not exactly the different kind of circumstances that people usually hope for. That was the situation that had befallen Winston not too long ago. What started as a simplistic, straightforward shopping trip with the goal of purchasing some affordable, stylish Swedish furniture had resulted in him having to adopt a completely different lifestyle. You see, Winston was one of the untold number of people to have an encounter with SCP-3008, better known colloquially as the Infinite IKEA. Appearing as an ordinary store, those entering the doors of SCP-3008 find themselves in an unending labyrinth of aisles upon aisles filled with flat-pack homeware. It can be quite the system shock, of course, especially when people that find themselves inside the Infinite IKEA learn there's no way to escape, even by retracing their steps back the way they came. Doing so, they'll only be met with a disheartening realization that the entrance isn't where it was upon their arrival. Now at first, learning that you've lost your entire life and are doomed to spend the rest of your days inside a limitless IKEA is admittedly a lot to take in. Your friends, family, job, all your worldly possessions are now unreachable, and everyone back home might likely spend many years wondering what happened to you. But it's not all bad news. As previously mentioned, Winston wasn't the only one to find himself in this predicament. Over the years, countless people have found their way inside the Infinite IKEA. Given how expansive the interior of the never-ending store was, there has never been a way to know for certain exactly how many people have come to reside within SCP-3008, but it's enough to populate the number of small settlements that these survivors have been able to establish inside. By innovatively repurposing the materials around them, these individuals have found themselves to be the new denizens of SCP-3008. Imagine whole towns constructed from chairs and tables that have been used as building materials to provide a place of sanctuary to those that need it when they first arrive in the Infinite IKEA. Sure, it takes a pretty big adjustment to this new lifestyle, But luckily, SCP-3008 provides for its inhabitants by automatically replenishing the food within its canteen. Naturally, it only offers items that are on the IKEA menu, but that's at least a consistent source of food and nutrition for those dwelling in its aisles. With food already taken care of, people inside SCP-3008 didn't even need to work. That was the strangest part that Winston found himself having to adapt to when he first got to the settlement of Cookware, named after the nearby sign that hung from the ceiling nearby, denoting one of the many departments of the store. It was odd to him how friendly everyone was, how much the people trapped inside 3008 cut off from the outside world forever seemed happy. There were many who'd been there for the longest that even claimed it was a better sense of life than out there in the real world. Inside the IKEA, there was a strong sense of community. Settlements helped each other out with construction, and because everything was provided for, no one had any need for selfishness or greed. After all, there was plenty of food to go around and money had no relevance. Ironic given they were all living inside a huge furniture store. Witnessing all of that helped Winston adapt to his new life inside SCP-3008 and made him feel a lot better about being in this predicament. The only real thing anyone inside the Infinite IKEA had to worry about was the threat of the staff. These were the tall, faceless humanoids with elongated arms and legs that roamed the aisles of the furniture store while wearing distinctive IKEA uniforms. Most of the time, they remained docile, paying the human survivors little attention. That is, until the fluorescent lights above dimmed, signaling the beginning of nighttime. The staff usually became aggressive, repeating the ominous phrase, "The store is now closed. Please exit the building," and attacking anyone they came into contact with. Thanks to their ingenuity, the survivors in the IKEA had constructed barriers around their settlements to keep the staff out. And that did the trick, repelling the faceless employees that come at night. But little did anyone inside SCP-3008 realize that simple barricades wouldn't stop an entirely new threat from entering the store to disrupt their peaceful way of life. For outside the Infinite IKEA, something wicked was stirring. Meanwhile, at a facility belonging to the SCP Foundation, a researcher by the name of Corbin Donnell had recently been assigned to SCP-035. Also known as the Possessive Mask, this white porcelain mask could shift between a comedy grin or a tragic frown. It also had the nasty trait of being an evil psychic artifact that could manipulate anyone around it into placing the mask over their face. At that point, SCP-035 would take full control of its wearer, making them into a host for the mask itself. So, would you like to take a guess as to what happened to researcher Donnell? The voice in his head, that persuasive whisper, it wouldn't leave him alone. All day long, it was there, but whenever Corbin was near SCP-035, it got louder, and as the days he was studying the possessive mask went on, the whisper became a shout. The screams to put on the mask were taunting him, keeping him awake at night, tormenting him all through the waking day, until eventually he'd had enough. Given that SCP-035 produced a corrosive black substance that usually melted anything around it, the mask had to periodically be taken out of its containment case so that the container housing it could be replaced. And it was during one of these transfers that researcher Donnell calmly swept in, pushing away the guards taking it out of its melted case before they could place it in a new one. The aggression from the researcher caught the security personnel by surprise, as did what he did next. Not caring what the possessive mask would do to him, Corbin lifted the white porcelain to his face. He wasn't even aware that the containment breach alarms were sounding. All that noise sank into the background as the psychic voice in his head got louder than it ever had before. There wasn't even so much as a split-second awareness from researcher Donnell of the searing pain as the dark sludge oozing from the mask made contact with his skin, melting his face as he wore SCP-035. By that point, it was already too late. The possessive mask had full control. Corbin's body wasn't his own anymore, although it still moved, walking quickly out of the room and through the halls of the Foundation facility. The researcher beneath was already dead. There was only SCP-035, piloting its newest host to freedom. Of course, while containment breach was still an urgent matter, the Foundation knew that SCP-035's biggest weakness was itself. The black secretion that poured out of the possessive mask would melt anything it came into contact with, and would ultimately cause the body of its host to melt into nothing. Once that happened, it would be far easier to recontain SCP-035. Someone would merely have to pick it up and place it back in the containment case. However, SCP-035 knew this, too. The mask itself was cunning. It hadn't just picked researcher Donnell at random to be its new vehicle. It wanted him specifically because of his previous posting. Before he had worked with SCP-035, Corbin had been stationed to observe any potential changes at the entrance of SCP-3008. As it stayed firmly on the researcher's face, using him to carry itself out of the Foundation's site it had been trapped in, SCP-035 was scouring the remnants of Corbin's mind. It used its innate psychic abilities to plunder the depths of his brain, looking for information. The location of SCP-3008 was right there, stored away safely in researcher Donnell's memories, as was the way to get there. And on top of that, the reason SCP-035 had taken such an interest in making it to the Infinite IKEA. During the Foundation's many years of study and exploration of SCP-3008, they came to learn that not all of the survivors inside the Infinite IKEA had originated from the same universe. The current theory was that the entrances to this endless furniture store existed simultaneously in multiple realities, meaning that the people now living alongside each other inside SCP-3008 were actually from varying different worlds across the multiverse. Now, if you were incredibly cunning, incredibly clever, and incredibly sick of being held captive by the Foundation, then perhaps you could figure out a way to navigate your way through the Infinite IKEA. You could enter through the front door in one universe, and then exit into another. And of course, that was what the possessive mask was planning to do. As it approached the main entrance of SCP-3008, the black sludge leaking out of the mask had almost destroyed what was left of researcher Corbin Donnell. It wiped more of the corrosive secretion onto the guards stationed at the Infinite IKEA, melting through them as SCP-035 made its way inside. First things first, the mask knew it had to find itself a new body to pilot before Corbin's expired. And it didn't take long for the possessive mask to happen across an unwitting candidate between the aisles of flat-pack tables. At around the same time this was happening, Winston, having long since gotten used to the rhythm of life inside SCP-3008, was on his way to the food court. He knew the route by heart now, and as he strolled closer, he was pondering over what he'd help himself to today from the menu. But it was while making his way there that he noticed something, or rather, he noticed not something, that he usually did. There were no staff anywhere around. Although they did not pay the survivors any mind during the day, when the lights of the IKEA were on, Winston knew that the staff members were always present. There were usually a couple milling about the aisles he had to pass in order to get from the settlement of cookware to the food hall, but today, there were none. And while this wouldn't usually be any cause for alarm, it kept playing on Winston's mind as he sat down to eat his plate of Swedish meatballs. He'd been inside SCP-3008 for such a long time that he'd become accustomed to the routine of living there, and the absence of the staff immediately stuck out as something that was out of its usual place. Finishing his food, Winston asked around, talking with his fellow residents of the Infinite IKEA, asking if any of them had encountered any of the tall, faceless staff members on their way to get their meals. Each and every one of them that he asked, from varying different settlements, all answered the same, that they hadn't spotted any staff all day. As much as they were a minor threat to the human beings living inside the Infinite IKEA, the absence of the store's only other residents kept playing on Winston's mind. Whatever was going on, the staff seemingly vanishing couldn't mean anything good, and so he decided to venture out into the aisles to figure out what exactly was going on. What he found was unlike anything anyone had ever seen in SCP-3008 before. It took Winston several long and uneventful hours to catch even a momentary glimpse of a staff member. He almost felt like someone trekking through a forest looking to get a sighting of Bigfoot or some other elusive urban legend. But as the third hour became the fourth, he spotted a hint of movement between the aisles. Following at a safe distance, listening out for the slightest sounds, Winston couldn't help but think he detected the noise of something heavy being dragged along the stone floor. Peeking out from between the aisles, he saw them. A huge group of staff members were all huddled in a display dining room, only there was something different about all of them. They still retained their recognizable tall and humanoid shapes, with long, disproportionate limbs, but there was something smeared over the staff, a dark, oily black substance that seemed to melt through the floor as it dripped off them. From his hiding place, Winston soon saw where that substance had originated from. The thing being dragged across the floor was another staff member, looking more normal than the rest. One of the others, covered in the corrosive sludge, was gripping it by the collar of its IKEA polo shirt and bringing it through the group. Meanwhile, the ordinary creature was thrashing and flailing its lengthy arms around, trying to get free. It was dragged up to a staff member in the middle of the group, which turned and shocked Winston at the strange sight of it. This staff member, evidently the leader, had a face, or rather, it was wearing a mask. SCP-035 was now firmly affixed to the slender, faceless being, its expression locked in a wide grin that seemed to convey a twisted sense of glee. Its black secretion didn't seem to be affecting its new host in the same way it usually did. The body of the staff member it was now piloting didn't seem to dissolve. As the uncorrupted staff creature was presented to the masked leader, SCP-035 compelled its newfound followers to restrain their prisoner. The workers within SCP-3008 didn't have much in the way of their own free will, or even personalities to speak of. They did, however, seem to share some sort of connection to each other, a hive mind of sorts. So presented with a powerful psychic force like the possessive mask, the entity had been able to not only take over one of the staff members as its new host, but spread its influence to the others. And while Winston watched horrified, it unknowingly demonstrated this. The captive staff member was grabbed and held by the others, its long arms and legs pulled apart. The huddled group lifted it up off the floor so that it couldn't free itself and run off into the endless aisles of furniture. Wearing SCP-035, the leader extended an arm, black ooze dripping from it, the droplets burning holes in the floor as it reached towards the faceless head of the restrained staff member. It placed a large hand over the faceless head of the captive. More of the corrosive secretion passed on to the newest addition to SCP-035's growing army. As the black substance spread over the staff member, so did the influence of the possessive mask force its way into another vessel.
I'm telling you, I know what I saw!
Winston protested, after recounting the events to the other settlers back at Cookware.
There's something else out there, something new and dangerous, and it's infecting the staff.
Oh, that's ridiculous,
replied Bryce, one of the survivors who had been there much longer.
I've been here for years and I've never even heard of such a thing.
They yelled.
I saw it with my own eyes,
Winston argued.
It has a small army of them already under its control.
Even if what you're saying is true,
someone else chimed in.
What does it matter? We've already got barriers that keep the staff out, and they only attack at night anyways. Surely, even if this mask thing really is in control of them now, who cares?
As if on cue, one of the lookouts at the Cookware settlement started frantically trying to get everyone's attention. They pointed to the ominous glow coming from just beyond the nearby aisles filled with wardrobe frames. An orange flicker was visible, even under the lights of the store which were still on, although blocked a little by thick plumes of black smoke rising up towards the ceiling.
That's lighting,
the lookout said in shocked disbelief, stating the name of another nearby community of survivors that was named after an IKEA store department.
Something must have happened over there,
Bryce declared.
Maybe it's an electrical fire that's gotten out of control.
It's them, Winston said solemnly.
It can't be them,
the older survivor snapped.
The lights are still on. It's still daytime in the store and the staff never attacked during the day. I don't think the rules are the same anymore.
Frustrated, Winston continued to argue.
There's no telling what that mask did to them. Perhaps.
Bryce was trying desperately to come up with a suggestion, but was clearly grasping at straws.
What if this mask can be reasoned with? If it's more intelligent than the staff, we can negotiate. There must be something it wants.
What do you think it wants? It wants this place, this IKEA. And now it has control of enough staff to form a small army.
You think it's just gonna stop there? It's coming for all of us, and it won't stop until it's got the whole store under its control. And if it has to wipe us out to do that, well, it looks like it's not hesitating. So what do we do?
A voice called meekly. Winston turned to see the townsfolk of Cookware had gathered, all looking up at him with terrified expressions on their faces. He gazed back at each one of them, then looked back over at the smoke now towering over where lighting had been and was now in flames. Who knew how many of the settlers there were still alive, and how long it would be before SCP-035 and its new army did the same to cookware? Something had to be done.
We need to get the word out.
Winston announced to the other survivors.
I need our fastest to run over to the other towns in the store. You each take one, you pass on the message, and then you come back. You know your way around well enough, so avoid anywhere you'd normally see staff. Even if they haven't been corrupted, we can't chance it. Why don't we tell the other settlements?
Somebody in the crowd called.
You tell them what's going on. You say that something has come here to threaten this IKEA and our way of life. This place isn't where any of us first came from, but it's all our home now. It's provided for us, but now it needs us to defend it.
Winston explained.
And how exactly are we gonna do that?
Bryce asked. The lights had gone out, but although night had fallen, it wasn't dark yet. Standing with their fellow survivors from numerous other settlements, the residents of SCP-3008 had fashioned flaming torches from the legs of IKEA desks and tables. And that wasn't all. They were carrying makeshift weapons. Some had spears crafted using curtain rails with sharp kitchen implements fashioned to the end. Others had wardrobe doors in their hands to act as rudimentary shields. They were hardly warriors, but as an army of corrupted staff members lurched out of the darkness towards them, each survivor of SCP-3008 knew what they had to do. At the front of the army towered the staff member with SCP-035 on its faceless head. The possessive mask's wide grin had shifted, now a long frown, almost one of disgust at the amassed settlers who opposed it. As it raised an elongated arm to command its horde, Winston raised a curtain rail spear into the air.
For IKEA!
He yelled, as the residents of SCP-3008 charged. Panic had set in. Researchers were frantic. There was a buzz of activity, not born of excitement, but from sheer, widespread fear. The Scarlet King was coming. Nobody at the Foundation knew when or even how the monstrous multiversal tyrant would spring free and bring endless chaos with him, but everyone knew it would be soon. They'd all had the same warning, the same nightmare. In fact, it wasn't just the Foundation either. The entire world had shivered in their sleep, sharing in the bad dream of the destruction that was yet to come. The personnel of the SCP Foundation were on high alert. Of course, the organization had been aware of the impending threat of the Scarlet King for longer than almost anyone else, but that was part of the problem. Through some anomalous dream had by everyone on Earth, now everyone else knew. The Foundation was less interested in uncovering the source of the nightmare, and more trying to counteract its potential side effects. That was what potentially offered the Scarlet King the power he needed to enter into reality after all. The more people knew about him, tried to understand or to find the eldritch entity, the more power he was able to obtain.
We have an army!
One member of personnel chimed in during a frantic debate.
We have an almost unlimited fighting force that are specially trained to handle anomalous threats, the MTF. Are you crazy?
Another argued.
The MTFs are certainly not unlimited. At any rate, the Scarlet King might be one of the most powerful beings in the entire multiverse. How can our troops, even our anomalous units, even hope to stand against that? You're proposing sending our people into a slaughter.
They'd all be wiped out in a moment, one of the other researchers concurred. We need to be focusing our efforts on the amnestic rollout. If we can distribute enough to the population, we can wipe their collective memories of the dream from the other night. They'll forget, and that should slow the approach of the Scarlet King.
Slow him, maybe, but it won't stop him,
the first retorted.
Full-scale retaliation is still our best option. Even now, while we try to come up with a strategy that could be enough to draw him in, we're willing him into existence as we speak. What about deploying another SCP?
Came a voice from the edge of the group. It belonged to junior researcher Jake Harrison, a relatively new member of the Foundation who had been reading up on files related to the Scarlet King. He knew that in trying to understand and come up with a way to best the murderous multiversal warlord, that he was inadvertently feeding him power. But Jake seemed to have stumbled on the one solution that everyone else had overlooked. There was already another anomaly that might have been perfectly suited for defeating the Scarlet King.
What do you suggest, Harrison?
One of the other researchers spat.
You really think something like 682 would be willing to work with us and destroy the Scarlet King? That's absurd. I heard 682 is meant to be one of the Scarlet King's children, another remarked. No, not 682, Jake argued, turning to the researcher that had just made a comment about the entity's supposed children, a group of anomalies that we believe to have been born of the Scarlet King himself. But you're on the right track. We use SCP-999.
The group of researchers looked dumbfounded at Jake. He couldn't tell if they were about to yell at him or they would all burst out laughing. To his surprise, they actually looked to be considering his proposal. It was widely believed that SCP-999, the adorable blob of orange slime known as the Tickle Monster, was actually the final child of the Scarlet King. "That's not entirely implausible," one of the researchers answered. SCP-999 is believed to be an ultimate force for good that could, in theory, defeat his father. The Scarlet King is meant to be unparalleled chaos. The two could cancel each other out, another theorized. But the Tickle Monster, sorry, SCP-999, it's an infant, a child, someone else pointed out. Even if it could one day beat the Scarlet King, it's nowhere near strong enough to yet. We might have days, minutes even, before he arrives, and I don't know if 999 has the power to stop his father. Then what if we could make him stronger? Jake replied, a risky idea brewing in his head. Surely you aren't suggesting. Suddenly a loud rumbling rang out, like an earthquake, only much louder. And instead of coming from the ground below, the noise was coming from the sky. The Foundation's researchers raced in the nearest window or ran out of the buildings they were in to turn their gazes upward. Scored across the sky above was a deep, blood-red crack, a wound in the fabric of reality itself. It was huge, almost covering one horizon to the next, and everyone looking at it knew what it meant. That crack in the sky heralded the approach of the Scarlet King. Junior researcher Harrison spent the next hour impatiently trying to get a hold of someone, anyone who could approve his proposal. The O5 Council were already swamped with suggestions for how to stop the Scarlet King, each one contributing to his rapid approach. Eventually, Jake made it through and spoke directly with a representative, an underling for the O5 Council. "Listen to me," he urged. "I know this isn't your department, but I need someone to sign off on this, please. The lives of everyone in this reality could depend on it." "What are you proposing?" "The clockworks, SCP-914, Jake answered. "We place SCP-999 inside, speed up the process, and make him strong enough to stop the Scarlet King." It was an astronomical gamble, using the Anomalous Improvement Machine, constructed of a multitude of clockwork components. Cogs, gyros, gears. SCP-914 was a device that could be used to enhance or refine any object placed inside its input booth. Depending on the setting, items could be transformed, destroyed, or vastly improved using the clockworks. Rough setting disintegrated any test subject, while coarse dismantled it to its base components. One-to-one replaced any item with an almost identical copy. Then there were the fine and very fine settings. The former would cause 914 to improve any item and the later capable of the same, but with one key difference. Very fine would refine an object even more, usually by giving it anomalous properties. Jake had read up on SCP-914 and knew that the Foundation had permitted researchers to conduct tests using the machine. However, following a catastrophic test, nothing organic could be tested in SCP-914. That was a strict rule. No biological organism or living thing of any description was to be placed within the clockworks. It was Jake's hope, however, that desperate times called for desperate measures. Surely, with the Scarlet King almost upon them, the Council would waive the restriction and allow SCP-999 to undergo refinement. The O5 Council representative's voice cut out after Jake made his suggestion. There was a long pause. Even without the pressure of incoming calamity, the silence seemed to extend for a painfully long time. Suddenly, someone else spoke up in their place, a modulated, distorted voice. It quickly became clear to Jake that he was talking directly to a member of the O5 Council. Under a different set of circumstances, he might have felt honored, but right now it was almost as scary as the threat of destruction by the Scarlet King.
"Listen closely, junior researcher,"
the council member said on the other end of the comm line.
"You may think you understand SCP-914. You may even think that it might aid us in stopping the current crisis, but you are far, far mistaken. You will cease this current course of action immediately. Your proposal has been denied."
"But wait!" Jake protested. "Surely it could work. I know biological material isn't permitted inside the clockworks, but that doesn't mean it can't affect living matter. SCP-999 is a living organism. If he really is everything we think he is, and we just put him through the refinement process, he could—"
"No, researcher Harrison," the voice barked. "Using the clockworks would mean we risk losing 999.
"What are you talking about?"
You appear to have a fundamental misunderstanding of SCP-914, junior researcher.
the council member chastised. "It doesn't merely improve upon existing objects, but replaces them with a new version it creates. If we were to place 999 inside, the creature as we know it would be gone forever. And if it really is capable of stopping this catastrophe, we will then have lost our ultimate weapon against the Scarlet King."
But
Jake tried to say. "Enough! Every second we waste discussing our options, the more power the Scarlet King is able to amass."
so why don't we stop talking and actually do something?
The young researcher shouted, giving in to his frustration and losing his temper. The comm line went dead. There was no one on the other end anymore. Another rumbling sound rippled through the building, even louder than the last tremor. Jake ran towards a nearby window and looked out in horror. It was already too late. The red crack above had split open wider, and like a tidal wave, hordes of nightmarish creatures came spilling out, raining down on the world. And commanding them, sending forth his minions in a flood of destruction, was the Scarlet King himself. Jake was done waiting for permission from the council. He sprinted as fast as he could through the facility, past panicked researchers fleeing for their lives, while security officers and MTF troops abandoned their posts in the futile hope they could survive the end of this reality and all others. Jake forced himself not to pay attention. He needed to find SCP-999. The playful blob was often free to roam around the facility, improving the days of anyone it encountered. So all Jake needed to do was find anyone who seemed happy despite the catastrophe, and SCP-999 wouldn't be so far away. Outside, the world began to resemble the nightmare that everyone had experienced the night before. Cities were burning as monstrous abominations tore through innocent civilians and ripped buildings and cars to shreds, reducing every nearby standing structure to little more than rubble with frightening speed and ease. The Scarlet King and his armies had been waiting for this moment for centuries, millennia, eons even. And now nothing could stop them from unfurling pure, indulgent chaos on this reality. They had their work cut out for them, subjugating and destroying the entire multiverse, but that isn't to say they weren't enjoying it. People across the Earth were being killed in droves in the name of the Scarlet King. He diverted a significant portion of his forces to attacking the SCP Foundation itself, while the boots-on-the-ground MTF troops, the ones that had remained loyal, were usually a formidable fight. They were no match for the eldritch armies of the Scarlet King. The Horde began to set free other anomalies kept locked up in containment, either by accident when they stormed the Foundation facilities, or intentionally seeking out their cells to spring them. Some SCPs tried to stand up to the Scarlet King and fight back, the likes of the Plague Doctor,
The Spectre,
and SCP-2800 all tried their best to ward off the oncoming attacks of the Scarlet King's foot soldiers. They lasted longer than those who decided instead to run away, turning heel and trying in vain to escape the destructive reach of the Scarlet King. Even anomalies like SCP-106, who could escape to other planes of existence or pocket dimensions, weren't safe. In hiding, they were only prolonging the inevitable. The Scarlet King would find them all. No corner of the multiverse was safe. And of course, some SCPs thrived in the catastrophe. Creatures like SCP-682, the infamous hard-to-destroy reptile, found themselves free to exact revenge on the Foundation and humanity at large. Of these, not all the anomalies gave away their allegiance. 682 in particular was too busy killing anything it came into contact with, whether they were human or part of the Scarlet King's army. But other SCPs gladly swore fealty with the Crimson Cosmic Conqueror, forming alliances with the entity responsible for setting them loose and joining the massive monstrosities he had unleashed. And yet, in the midst of all the chaos, the calamity, and the millions upon millions of deaths, one junior SCP Foundation researcher was still searching for the wholesome orange blob. Jake Harrison had put all his chips on SCP-999 and eventually tracked the tickle monster down. The building around him was crumbling, attacks from the Scarlet King and his minions bombarding every second. As Jake ran into the mess hall, his eyes instantly caught sight of the ball of orange slime, cowering under a table.
Hey,
He whispered, hoping to coax it out.
it's okay. I know there's a lot going on right now. Hell, it's the end of the world outside, but if you come with me, I think we can fix it together. Come on, little guy, what do you say?
As if in reply, 999 immediately leaped up out of its hiding place. Jake caught it in his arms, instantly feeling a wave of calm wash over him thanks to the tickle monster's calming, anomalous effect. He tried to stop himself from fully succumbing to the good vibes that the gelatinous creature provided. After all, he still had a job to do, and time was short. The Scarlet King and his invading army might have seemed, for the most part, to be indulging in wanton destruction, decimating cities and Foundation sites, killing humans left, right, and center. But Jake figured that if there was any method to their madness, then SCP-999 would be at the very center of it. Not even the Scarlet King knew for certain if SCP-999 really was his offspring. Maybe he had heard the rumors and wanted to reach the tickle monster just before it had a chance to stop him, if it even could. If the Scarlet King believed even for a second that his supposed son stood a chance at defeating him and ending his reign of terror, then he'd waste no time hunting the orange blob down. His army of nightmarish creatures would comb every corner of the world until they found SCP-999. Although they might not think to look inside the clockworks. Placing the smiling, slimy SCP in the input booth, Jake fiddled with the controls for SCP-914. He'd never performed any experiments using the machine before, but it was all pretty self-explanatory, throwing the dial to very fine. He gave a moment's pause, looking at the adorable anomaly in the machine. The warning from the council rang in his ears. If he activated the clockworks, he'd in effect be killing SCP-999. Either that or the Scarlet King would do it himself when he found the tickle monster. Neither scenario ended well. Then the thundering sounds of the massacre outside got louder. Screams coming from innocent people who were being caught in the Scarlet King's carnage. There was no question about it. If what Jake was about to do really could stop all this mayhem, then it was worth replacing SCP-999 to do it. With a deep breath, he flipped the switch. The clicking and clacking of the clockwork's components whirred into life were drowned out by the approaching tremors. Something was coming. No, he was coming, Jake thought. The very fabric of the building around him started shaking, brickwork and cement crumbling and falling apart as a large hand, fingers ending in pointed crimson claws, wrenched open the roof with ease. Looking up in horror, Jake saw that the sky was a dark shade of red. Towering over it, a colossal crimson-clad warrior looked in on the frightened researcher, horns protruding from its head. Maybe because SCP-999 was still nearby, the blob was offering him some kind of positive mental protection. Otherwise, the mere sight of the gigantic monstrous being above him would have driven Jake and any other mortal mad. The Scarlet King was upon him.
Where is he?
Came a booming voice that sounded like hundreds of screams overlaying each other. The Scarlet King's gaze seemed to shift slightly, turning from Jake as he lay helplessly on the ground to look at SCP-914. The machine had fully activated and couldn't be stopped now. Either through foreknowledge or some kind of cosmic sense, the eldritch monstrosity seemed to know exactly what the device did.
No! No! What have you done?
The Scarlet King roared. He raised a gargantuan fist and brought it straight down through the air towards Jake. He couldn't run. The Scarlet King was so vast in size that there was no way the researcher would be able to evade the oncoming strike. Jake raised his arms in a futile attempt to protect himself, despite knowing that the Scarlet King's fist would likely plunge through the very surface of the earth below. But then again, maybe the junior researcher just didn't want to watch. There was a pause. The strike never came. It was only when Jake built up the courage to open his eyes that he saw what had happened. A long tendril of orange slime had reached out of SCP-914, forming a protective barrier between Jake and the Scarlet King. Suddenly, with all the force of a tidal wave, the newly refined SCP-999 came pouring out of the clockworks. The tickle monster's mass had increased. He was thousands, if not millions of times bigger. Swept aside and out of harm's way by the orange slime, the junior researcher looked up in amazement as SCP-999 reached up into the sky, able to look its supposed father face to face. The Scarlet King recoiled in horror as the tickle monster engulfed him, pulling the cosmic crimson plunderer into an embrace. As they hugged, there seemed to be a change in the Scarlet King. The eldritch monster had spent all his time since the dawn of creation as a cruel, nihilistic conqueror. He had killed and enslaved, devoured ancient gods, and slaughtered entire planes of existence in his quest to annihilate everything. But now, held tight by his gelatinous son, his heart shifted. It was as if the Scarlet King's eyes had been opened, and he could see the beauty of creation. The sheer overwhelming goodness of SCP-999 enhanced by SCP-914 undid the evil of the Scarlet King himself. Only it didn't stop. As the orange slime engulfed the Scarlet King in a hug, he began to be unmade. The tickle monster, without even trying to harm its father, had been made into such a beacon of pure positivity by the clockworks that the Scarlet King simply ceased to exist. He was unwoven, not killed, but rendered without any purpose. He barely even felt any pain, but at the same time was removed from this and every other universe. And still, it didn't stop. The newly recreated SCP-999 spread across the world like an orange flood. The Scarlet King's armies, the other SCPs, even the few surviving human beings were all wiped away. SCP-999 spread to every corner of the Earth, turning the blue planet orange as he coded it, purging every single scrap of negativity, all hatred, all cruelty, all evil, even that of the SCP Foundation itself. The entire world was unmade by the tickle monster, not out of malice, but so that nobody anywhere could cause the Scarlet King to reemerge. At the same time, all that was left was a planet-sized ball of orange slime, lonely spinning through space. It is certainly not unheard of for a young girl to wake up in the middle of the night, looking for a glass of water. It is somewhat more exceptional when this late-night water run results in many, many deaths. Unless, of course, you're dealing with a very special young girl. SCP-053, also known as, well, the young girl. She possesses the innate ability to inspire delusions, paranoia, and eventually homicidal rage in anyone who spends too long around her, which, as you can probably imagine, makes it hard to live a normal life. One night, the young girl woke up to something incredibly strange. The door of her cell, typically tightly sealed, was wide open, and a strange flashing red light was shining in through the hallway. The sound of a distant alarm is what had woken her up. What the young girl didn't know was that the site confining her had just experienced a mass containment breach as a result of a major electrical malfunction. Some of the most terrifying creatures imaginable were roaming the halls in search of violence and carnage. But when the young girl got up and wandered out of her bedroom, she only wanted a glass of water to quench her midnight thirst. She wandered down a long, plain hallway, washed intermittently and read by the red flashing emergency lights. She rubbed the sleep out of her eyes and yawned. All this strange commotion. Maybe she's just having a bad dream. But what seems like a bad dream to her is a bona fide living nightmare for everyone around her. A few halls over, security personnel were being devoured alive by SCP-682. SCP-106, the old man, had just dragged a senior researcher into his pocket dimension to do unspeakable things to him. And a group of terrified admin staff are being lured out by what they think is a group of mobile task force operatives, but is actually a pack of hungry SCP-939 imitating their voices. Still, the young girl persisted in her quest for a refreshing drink, even as security personnel began to fan out through the building, hoping to get control over this rapidly devolving situation. A group of 5 armed security officers ran into the hallway and attempted to intercept the young girl, but the high stress they were feeling was only accelerated by the effects of the young girl's anomalous powers. They started to feel bugs crawling all over their skin. They started to get the sense that their fellow security officers weren't even people, but monsters wearing human skin suits. Their paranoia soon evolved into a blistering rage. Each of the men pulled out their guns and began firing at each other until only one was left standing, wounded but alive. With all the others dead, the object of his rage now became the young girl herself. He understood then that it was all her doing, that she'd made him do this. She was a monstrous little creature who took pleasure in twisting the minds of human beings into terrible forms. In reality, the young girl had no such feelings. Her powers were passive. She had no control over them. She even suffered from some kind of strange mental block that left her completely unaware that her powers were even taking effect. She was, in a sense, completely innocent. As the security officer pointed his gun at the young girl as she began walking into a nearby break room, he experienced her secondary anomalous effect. Anyone who attempts to hurt her will immediately die from either a heart attack or a stroke. The security officer suddenly felt an intense pain. sharp and brutal, exploding in his chest. He collapsed, dead before he even hit the ground, and the young girl had no idea. She couldn't if she tried. In the break room, the young girl found exactly what she was looking for. A classic office water cooler, complete with a stack of plastic cups. Perfect. She carefully took one of the cups and pulled down the lever on the cooler. Watching her cup fill as the tank above the cooler bubbled, she took a sip. Cool, refreshing spring water. Just what the doctor ordered. But the young girl suddenly looked up, shocked, to see that the tank above the water cooler was now shaking violently, as though it was going to explode. What was going on here? Had she broken it? She stepped back, dropping the rest of her cup of water to the ground. She felt frightened. That's when a crack formed in the plastic tank, and the water began slithering out. Not dripping or pouring, slithering, as though it had moved with mind and purpose. And that's because in this case, it did. The young girl hadn't just drank any water. She had drunk half a cup of water from SCP-054, the water nymph, a mysterious sentient woman made entirely from water. Much like the young girl, the water nymph is often a misunderstood anomaly, one that has received far more harm from the cruel treatment of the SCP Foundation than she's ever given to another. She's a naturally curious and compassionate creature whose trust has been abused. So when the containment breach alarm started to sound, much like the rest of the Foundation staff, she had tried to hide and find cover, not wanting to fall into the crosshairs of a far more dangerous and hostile anomaly. She had chosen the water cooler in Break Room 3, which seemed like a genius idea, until the young girl turned up. After years of being experimented on by Foundation researchers, the water nymph wasn't just about to tolerate more mistreatment. Whatever this strange little creature was who had just consumed some of her body, the water nymph would fight back and make it regret ever thinking that it could take advantage of her. The young girl, who really had just made an innocent mistake, began to panic and run as frightening, slithering tendrils of pure water came slithering after her. As the unfortunate security guard discovered earlier, trying to attack the young girl was typically a one-way ticket to a heart attack or fatal cerebral event. But seeing as the water nymph had neither a heart nor a brain, she was invulnerable, and the young girl was terrified. She ran out of the room, past the bodies of the men who had killed each other due to her influence outside. She wasn't even able to notice them. She kept running, and the water of the water nymph came slithering after her. The water nymph had never been the vengeful type, but after the abuse she'd suffered, she learned the value of putting her liquid foot down. She would not tolerate mistreatment, even from a being this small. The young girl kept running, breathing heavily. Because of the nature of her anomalous abilities, nobody could intervene and help her. Occasionally, she had run into groups of Foundation personnel trying to fight their way through the chaos, only to be anomalously affected and become part of the chaos themselves. They became violent, deranged monsters and started attacking each other, punching and biting. As they fell to the ground in a brawling pile, the young girl had to desperately climb over them as the streak of furious liquid followed her. Meanwhile, across the facility, the vicious, psychopathic old man was hungry for more. His mouth stretched into a wide, sadistic grin, and he continued walking further into the base. He would find new victims. He would feel their fear and drink in their dying screams. Several mobile task forces were dispatched from other nearby containment facilities. They'd likely reach the embattled site within the hour, but how many lives would be lost before then? The death count was already well into the double digits. After all this running, the young girl was getting tired. It was rare that she needed to truly avoid and escape a threat like this, and as such, she wasn't exactly prepared for such a scenario. She found her way into a broom closet and locked herself inside, hiding among mops and brooms. She tried to quiet her breathing, holding a tiny hand over her mouth. Red flashes continued to occasionally illuminate the corners of the door. She breathed in and out, in and out. Was something waiting outside? The young girl gasped as water started bubbling underneath the door. It started looking around her feet, then rising up from the ground. To the young girl, it was astonishing. The water was forming the shape of a woman standing right in front of her. Her lower lip trembled with fear. For a moment, she was at a loss for words. Then she gulped dryly and began to speak in a soft little voice. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. I promise, I was just thirsty." The water nymph tilted her head slightly, confused. Did this tiny child really mean this? Was it an honest mistake? After all the terrible things that had been done to her, the water nymph had difficulty trusting humans. But as the young girl started to cry for reasons she couldn't quite understand, the water nymph felt the urge to comfort her. Perhaps she wasn't with the Foundation. Perhaps this girl was just another prisoner. They were allies, not enemies. While the water nymph couldn't speak, as a show of solidarity, she began to transform. She got smaller, herself becoming a little girl made of water, almost mirroring SCP-053. She raised a hand and waved. The young girl giggled, seemingly put at ease. It'd been a long time since she met a new friend around here, and it seemed like the water nymph was ready to change that. Maybe they could escape this place together. The young girl opened the door and the two of them ran out together, passing through an adjacent hallway. The young girl ran while the water nymph slithered formlessly along behind her. They managed to sneak around and avoid detection from the many anomalies and Foundation guards duking it out for supremacy in the chaotic halls of the facility. In a sense, it provided the perfect cover for the unlikely duo to escape this bizarre situation. But they weren't out of the metaphorical woods yet. First, they were cornered by a trio of paranoid guards, all wielding handguns. However, the young girl's nightmarish ambient ability came in handy once more. The three men lost their minds and started killing each other, giving the young girl and the water nymph more time to escape and keep moving, though they were about to encounter the deadliest threat of all. The young girl took point, leading the water nymph down the nearest hallway, when suddenly, SCP-106, the old man, emerged from the wall right in front of her. He had such anomalous malice in him that the young girl's powers was effectively useless against him. He grinned and approached her, his arms extended, ready to ferry her off to the nightmare of his pocket dimension. The young girl had never felt so afraid. Until suddenly, the water nymph slithered in between them, and she assumed her full humanoid form once more, forming a wall between the young girl and the old man. This turned out to be the perfect way to save the young girl's life. SCP-106 has historically found liquid barriers incredibly confusing, and it's been widely considered to be one of the few ways to effectively delay the old man's rampages. Seizing the moment, the young girl turned and ran away. The water nymph had just saved her life. Sadly for them, neither the water nymph nor the young girl escaped that day. The mobile task forces arrived and took control of the facility again, recontaining the various anomalies who had escaped. But even if they never saw each other again, the water nymph and the young girl would forever remember how they helped each other on that incredibly strange day. Facing the council wasn't the daunting part. It was when the council turned their faces away that things became truly terrifying. Dr. Moto pleaded as he watched, his heart sinking as one by one, the members of the O5 Council literally turned their backs to him. Standing beneath the almost blinding spotlight overhead, he tried to look around the dimly lit chamber, searching for a way out, some kind of emergency exit he could rush toward, though he knew there was no hope of making it in time. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. It was just enough to catch his attention. Vines or tentacles splayed out and reached for him from behind. Their reddish-brown tint, caused by rust and blood, told him the sculpture was behind him. It had stopped for now. Seeing it in his peripheral vision was enough to hold it still. A quantum lock, one of the Foundation doctors had called it, the ultimate defense mechanism. Dr. Moto had once believed this too, but now he wasn't so sure. This wasn't part of the anomaly's defense. It was a trap. It was left unobserved so often, almost constantly, except during periodic cleanings. In those moments when nobody was looking, the sculpture was free to move. Personnel had heard scraping sounds when no one was inside the containment room. It hadn't just been free to move, it had been free to plot, to change. Now Moto was stuck, unable to look away from the anomaly, aware that as soon as he did, his life would end. The council would keep their backs turned until Dr. Moto's body fell, lifeless, his neck broken. Slowly Moto turned to face the anomaly, his gaze trailing up the winding rebar appendages, which would seize his throat the moment his aching eyes blinked. Its body, a large chunk of concrete vaguely shaped like a torso, gave way to a head with a spray-painted face above an open midsection of twisted rebar below. The rebar looked like intestines, as if the sculpture's guts were spilling out, aided by the red tint of dried blood. More rebar appendages protruded like legs from the lower part of the concrete. This wasn't the SCP-173 he remembered. It had changed. It used to look more like a statue, deliberately shaped by an anomalous artist. But nobody else remembered the old SCP-173. Everyone had called Dr. Moto insane for claiming that this new anomaly bore little resemblance to the sculpture he knew, and his word should have carried more authority on the matter. After all, he was the one who had first discovered SCP-173 all those years ago. The new SCP-173's lifeless concrete face was inches away. Even though it only had 2 hollow spaces on its spray-painted face that resembled eyes, it felt like the sculpture was glaring at him, accusingly. Dr. Moto's eyes began to water, urging him to blink, but he forced himself to keep looking. Don't blink, he thought, if he could hold on just a little longer. Several hours later, alarms blared as blood-red lights flashed through the hallways of SCP Foundation Site-19. Inside SCP-173's containment chamber, 3 personnel lay dead on the floor, one still clutching a mop in their cold, stiff fingers. It had been a routine bi-weekly cleaning. It should have been mundane, but the 2 members of personnel assigned to observe SCP-173 had blinked, thinking they were safe. With the 3rd person's back turned, SCP-173 had moved, snapping all of their necks. None of them had seen what killed them. Immediately, Class 4 hazardous object containment procedures were put into effect. Security teams rounded up groups of D-Class personnel, 2 to observe, 1 to place a cage around SCP-173. Once secured, they used a forklift or any other means to move the sculpture back to its cell. But there was just one problem. In the split second SCP-173 had been unobserved after breaking out of its cell, it had vanished. Nobody had thought to watch the outside of its containment chamber during cleaning. After all, the procedure was routine. But this time, the sculpture had used the opportunity to flee Site-19 altogether. Dr. Moto received the call moments later and was rushed to Site-19. His expertise with SCP-173 was unmatched, as he had been the one to discover the anomalous statue back in 2007 aboard a decommissioned U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. The Foundation hoped that consulting Moto would help track down the missing anomaly, but the moment he was shown security footage, he knew something was wrong. The Foundation had slowed down footage from Site-19's internal surveillance, scanning frame by frame until they found grainy stills of SCP-173 escaping the facility. But something was off. This was not the sculpture Dr. Moto had discovered. The Foundation personnel around him exchanged concerned glances. The image on screen was blurry, catching the sculpture in motion, but they all recognized it as SCP-173. Dr. Moto, though, insisted that the anomaly was bipedal, walking on 2 legs instead of multiple twisted rebar poles seen on this one. Its concrete skin had been a pale yellow, with traces of Krylon brand spray paint making up its crude facial features, with a bigger, more rotunded head. Nervously, researchers looked with uncertainty at the senior Foundation doctor. Not one of them had heard of the anomaly he was describing. Dr. Moto stormed out, frustrated and confused. Why did nobody else remember what SCP-173 looked like? Where had this new version of what was seemingly the same anomaly suddenly appeared from? As his mind raced, his cell phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered out of habit. On the other end was a voice he hadn't heard in years, one that he had all but forgotten. When SCP-173 was first discovered, the boat it had been hiding on was taken to a Foundation-owned salvage yard. Moto had asked a security guard, Jim, to contact him if there was ever any unusual activity aboard the decommissioned aircraft carrier. Now, all these years later, something was happening on the wreck of the USS Walrus, and Jim had kept his word. As Dr. Moto raced to the salvage yard, something heavy was crashing through the USS Walrus. Nobody had set foot aboard the Walrus since 2007, or rather, nobody human had. Although it didn't remember how SCP-173, the original version, had somehow appeared there some time ago, as if its decades spent locked up by the SCP Foundation had been little more than a bad dream. Now it was back in the closest thing to a home it had ever known, and free to move around unobserved. For a time, the old SCP-173 had been peacefully living in the belly of the USS Walrus, completely unaware that back in its containment chamber at the Foundation, another anomaly, identical in every way save for its appearance, had taken its place. Until that anomaly came bursting through the walls of the abandoned shipwreck. Rebar tendrils tore through the ship's weakened metal hull as the new SCP-173 forced its way inside. It moved swiftly, unobserved, driven by a singular instinctive purpose to find and destroy the other. Its rusted limbs snaked around pipes, and its senses honed in on the presence of its older counterpart aboard the ship. The sound of tearing metal echoed like an enraged animal's cry as the new SCP-173 ripped through walls, decimating everything in its path. Inside the bowels of the USS Walrus, the original SCP-173 sensed the intrusion. It had been living in the wreckage unbothered for years, but now something fearsome and unfamiliar had entered its home. The new version of SCP-173, while physically similar, radiated a hostility that the old sculpture could almost feel. The new version of the sculpture snarled, or would have if it had a mouth. Much like its predecessor, the anomaly had no face beyond a crudely painted facsimile of one. But that also meant that neither of them had eyes. The two anomalies now faced each other in the dim light of the ship's abandoned corridors. The new SCP-173 moved first, charging at the original, its rebar limbs lashing out at blinding speeds. The older version reacted instinctively, dodging just in time. Despite being unobserved, both anomalies could move at incredible speeds. So fast, in fact, that any human observer would barely be able to track their motions. But here, in the ship's isolated corridors, they were free to battle at full force. The new SCP-173 was faster, stronger, and more aggressive, its rebar tendrils wrapping around the neck of the older sculpture. The original struggled as cracks formed in its concrete body under the pressure, but it fought back with a desperate kick, knocking one of the new sculpture's rebar legs out from under it. The new version toppled forward, momentarily loosening its grip. The old SCP-173 seized the opportunity to break free, darting down the narrow corridor, trying to put as much distance as possible between itself and its relentless pursuer. The old SCP-173 knew it couldn't win this fight, not with sheer force. The new version was simply too powerful. Its only option was to escape, to find a way off the ship, or at least hide long enough to avoid destruction. But with every move it made, the new SCP-173 was right behind, tearing through the walls and corridors in its furious pursuit. Outside, Dr. Moto reached the salvage yard, rushing past the small security office and following Jim's directions to the wreck of the USS Walrus. The sounds of metal crashing and heavy stone scraping against the ship's interior were unmistakable. Something was happening inside, and it wasn't good. Moto's heart raced as he approached the ship. Suddenly, he stopped, his eyes widening in shock. A massive dent had appeared in the ship's outer hull, as if something or someone inside was smashing its way through. Inside the ship, the new SCP-173 had caught up to the original. With a powerful swing, it slammed the older sculpture against the wall, leaving a deep impression in the metal. The new version was stronger, more aggressive, and had a clear advantage. The original SCP-173 tried to fight back, but it knew it couldn't match the new version's sheer force. As the new sculpture's rebar limbs wrapped around its body, lifting it off the ground, the old SCP-173 realized it had no way to escape. There was only one way this could end. The new SCP-173 prepared to deliver the final blow. It hoisted the original high above its head, ready to slam down and shatter the older sculpture into pieces. If it had a mouth, it would have roared in triumph. But just as it was about to strike, both anomalies froze. They were being watched. A mobile task force had arrived, storming into the wreckage of the Walrus just in time. Their weapons raised, laser sights trained on both sculptures. The presence of observers instantly triggered SCP-173's quantum lock, freezing both versions in place. The old sculpture was suspended in midair, held above the head of the new version, inches away from being destroyed. Dr. Moto rushed into the ship behind the task force, insisting to the operatives that the older version was the real SCP-173. This new monstrosity must be some sort of related anomaly that had somehow taken its place in containment. But as Moto argued, the MTF commander received an order in his earpiece. Lowering his weapon, the commander motioned for his men to do the same. Silently, solemnly, they turned their backs on the two sculptures.
Wait, what are you doing?
Moto yelled, panicking.
You can't turn away. The second you'll stop watching, they'll...
Everything went dark as a bag was slipped over Moto's head. The task force restrained him, their orders clear. They were to take Dr. Moto to the O5 Council, who would decide his fate. As Moto struggled in their grip, the deafening sound of concrete smashing against metal echoed through the ship's interior. Though he couldn't see it, Moto could imagine what was happening. The new SCP-173 was finishing what it had started. It was slamming the older sculpture against the walls, breaking apart its concrete shell piece by piece, until nothing remained but rebar and dust. When the noise finally stopped, Moto was dragged away by the task force. His vision was still obscured by the dark bag over his head. Their orders were clear. Take him to the O5 Council. They would decide what to do with him, after explaining what had truly happened to SCP-173. Chaos had erupted. All hell had broken loose, and nightmares were running amok. Even from her perspective, watching as fleshy abominations tore through the streets of New York City, Eliza Flynn couldn't escape the feeling that the entire world had gone mad. Only moments before, things had been calm, normal, another mundane, uninteresting day in the Big Apple. Now she was watching in horror from underneath an overturned table as a group of things had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Unbeknownst to Eliza, these creatures were instances of something known as SCP-610, alternatively going by the name The Flesh That Hates. From her hiding place inside the local coffee shop she frequented, they looked like horrific mutated masses of flesh that barely resembled anything even close to human, but that's what they were, or at least had been. Eliza had witnessed a barista rushing out into the street, trying to get away from a group of SCP-610s that were bashing their appendages against the front window. In trying to make a break for it, the mutated creatures attacked the barista, killing him upon making contact with his skin. It was only a short while afterwards that Eliza spotted his body moving, the infectious process only accelerated by the heat from a nearby car that was on fire. Before long, what had once been a barista, an ordinary person, was now another of the grotesque flesh monsters. Mike, she remembered. His name had been Mike. She'd read it on his name tag when she came in for her morning coffee. He had always smiled, never got the spelling of her name right on her to-go cup, writing it with an S instead of a Z, and now he was gone. Worse than dead, he wasn't even Mike anymore, instead turned into another SCP-610 monstrosity. Too petrified to move, terrified of being caught and turned into another of the fleshy nightmares, Eliza stayed hidden. This was it, she thought to herself. Any moment now, one of those things would find her, either breaking through the street-facing window of the coffee shop or slithering in through the rear fire door. Sure enough, the flesh formerly known as Mike, the barista, turned. Where had once there been a head was now a featureless blob that had fused with the shoulder, but Eliza could tell its eyeless stare was being directed at her, and she had nowhere to run. Mike's arm, which was now a slimy blood-red tentacle, began slamming against the glass, cracks forming across the surface. Eliza's eyes darted around the room, trying to look for some kind of way out. Her options were limited, and even then, they didn't amount to more than hiding in a storage cupboard and prolonging the inevitable. She needed a miracle. As if to answer her prayers, a blinding white light erupted from somewhere out of view, beyond the window. Turning away, Eliza had to shield her eyes from the searing glow, blinking away spots in her vision as she looked to see what had happened. The SCP-610 creature, Mike, had vanished, a dark outline scorched against the glass, as if it had been obliterated by an intense, focused blast. That light, whatever it was, had vaporized it. The sound of commotion came bustling through the door, and distorted, mechanical-sounding voices called out. "Hello? Is anyone there? Hello? Is anyone in here?" one garbled. "We mean you no harm," another said. "But you need to leave this place as soon as you can." Cautiously, Eliza stood up from under the table. Standing at the entrance to the coffee shop were a trio of figures. Each one of them had machinery, all manner of metallic components protruding from their bodies, replacing arms, legs, parts of their faces. Eliza stared at them, unsure whether these cyborgs were as harmless as they claimed. One even had a cannon in place of one of their hands, which was still smoking from the blast that had killed the SCP-610 instances outside. "Did the flesh make contact with you?" one of the figures asked. "No," Eliza replied. "That's how they spread, right? It's like an infection. I watched it happen." "Indeed," the cyborg with the cannon arm replied. "The flesh being loose is only the beginning. If you are uninfected, then we'd ask you to come with us. We'll explain on the way." "Hang on, who are you?" Eliza asked, concern on her face. "And where are you taking me?" "We are the Church of the Broken God," one of them answered, "and we're getting you out of New York." The idea of a person making their way out of a city that never sleeps on foot would be laughable to anyone that lived there, even before it had become overrun with monsters. But the subway wasn't exactly running on time, and the roads were gridlocked with cars that had either been destroyed or abandoned by their owners. So walking out of New York was the only option. The Church of the Broken God cyborgs explained to Eliza as much as they knew about what had happened. They described an organization, a secret cabal with power spanning the entire world called the SCP Foundation. Apparently, this foundation had been responsible for gathering and safeguarding the world from dangerous and unexplained phenomena. "You mean like those flesh things?" she asked. "Exactly. They called those SCP-610. But recently, something had changed. The Foundation had turned its seemingly inexhaustible resources to the goal of exterminating humanity. It was by their hands that instances of SCP-610 had been unleashed in major cities, not just New York, but Delhi, Tokyo, London, and countless others. Those were far from the only anomalies the Foundation had deployed either. As they walked, the cyborgs described how someone called Mr. Deeds had been assassinating heads of state the world over. They also spoke of a horrifying reptile that was now running wild and slaughtering everything in its path. "We at the church had to act. Whatever the Foundation's reasons for unleashing this hell, we couldn't sit by and allow them to destroy everything. So we've aligned ourselves with the Global Occult Coalition to assist them in fighting against the flesh that hates. In exchange, we have vowed to help transport survivors to safety." "But where can we possibly go that's safe?" Eliza interjected. "If the Foundation have the reach you say they do, if they have all these horrible creatures at their disposal, what chance do we have at surviving?" "Well, there is always our path," one of the Broken God's followers replied. "The path of standardization, becoming one with machine. Our mechanized parts are safe from the flesh's corruption. If you would consider joining us." Eliza took a quick glance at the metallic components of her cyborg companions. They looked like they hurt as much as becoming a SCP-610 monster would have. She politely declined, although it led to the rest of their journey continuing in an awkward silence. Eventually, the Broken God cyborgs brought Eliza to an extraction point, where they left her in the care of the Global Occult Coalition. Boarding a convoy, her and a number of others were ferried out of New York State by the GOC. For the first time since this had all started, Eliza started to think that maybe she was heading to somewhere safe. That sliver of hope all came crashing down the moment the convoy was attacked. Armed assailants opened fire on the trucks. They were quickly identified by Coalition soldiers as members of the SCP Foundation's mobile task forces, special operations troops sent out to pick off survivors. In the midst of the firefight, gunfire erupting all around her, Eliza never felt so terrified. One of the GOC officers turned to her as they crouched behind cover. "Listen, I shouldn't be telling you this, but there's rumors of a survivor settlement not far from here," he barked. "I'll draw their fire. You run. Get as far away from here fast as you can and don't look back." Doing as she was told, Eliza sprinted away from the wreckage of the convoy until her legs refused to run any further. She trudged alone through an empty town, abandoned. It felt like a place out of a nightmare. The world was decimated, virtually post-apocalyptic. The further she willed herself to walk, the more she could feel herself giving up that she would never even find the settlement, if it even existed at all. Hope had abandoned her, and at her lowest point, Eliza dug her heels in and dropped to the ground, both exhausted and convinced she'd been hiking towards nothing. The feeling of being moved caused Eliza to stir, waking her up from a dream that had been almost as bleak as her new reality. Someone was carrying her on what felt like a stretcher, she quickly realized. Before she had a chance to ask who they were, the pair of shadowy human shapes brought her through the woods to what looked like a campsite. "Don't be alarmed," one of them said in a voice that sounded so optimistic it felt almost alien, as if this person was from another planet where things were far less horrible. Looking around, Eliza noticed the glow of a campfire illuminating the nearby trees. A handful of people were huddled together in makeshift tents, resting and wearing contented, almost happy expressions. Then Eliza's eyes were drawn towards something else, some slimy mass gliding around the camp. At first she thought it was another instance of SCP-610, until she saw an amorphous, gelatinous orange blob glowing in the firelight. To the Foundation, it had been known as SCP-999, but to its newfound family of human survivors, this creature was their savior, a bastion of hope and happiness in a devastated hellscape, the Tickle Monster. Welcomed into the survivor community with open arms, Eliza was soon exposed to SCP-999's anomalous effects. The creature seemed to warm to her instantly, greeting her with the enthusiastic friendliness of a small dog. Even after as little as a single interaction with it, she felt her lack of hope and depressed feelings towards the bleakness of the world had almost entirely faded. She felt happiness, pure, genuine happiness, for the first time in recent memory. Thanks to the Tickle Monster, Eliza's entire outlook had completely changed. The same was true for the other survivors that had formed a settlement around the happy orange creature. They had all come seeking an escape, not just a physical place that was out of harm's way, but somewhere they could reject the harsh reality of what the SCP Foundation had done to the world. And SCP-999 had provided that for them all, curing the displaced refugees of their woes, keeping them in perpetually high spirits. Most of them had reached such a point of contentment that they'd forgotten their old lives before the collapse, before the anomalies, and the Foundation. Although the Tickle Monster demanded nothing of its newfound family, apart from the occasional playful tickle wrestle, Eliza and a group of the other survivors would venture back to the nearby abandoned town just beyond the woods. Once there, they would scavenge for as much food as they could find, keeping a close eye out for any candy with which to feed SCP-999. Even though they knew 999 was more than happy to provide positivity to the survivors, each one of them felt it was the least they could do for their favorite orange slime ball. There was such a continuous state of love and happiness in their camp that the survivors were hardly fazed when a Foundation soldier inadvertently stumbled upon their settlement. Before he could raise his weapon and fire, SCP-999 slid between its friends and the soldier, blocking the path of his bullets. Without any shred of malice or hostility, the delightful blob leaped towards the attacking MTF operative and embraced him. Instantly, the Foundation foot soldier's demeanor changed. Before he had been glassy-eyed, emotionless, like something deep inside him had broken. But after their hug parted, the man was euphoric, grinning in a state of elation for long afterwards. For a time, Eliza sat with the soldier, Sergeant Callows, and listened to him explaining how he wanted to renounce the Foundation, to stay with this community of survivors now he knew SCP-999 was here. "Do you remember anything from before?" she asked curiously. "Before?" Callows echoed. "You mean before the Foundation did all this?" Eliza nodded. Remembering the outside world was hazy now, like trying to recall the vague details of a dream. "Not much," the former MTF trooper answered. "They wanted us to kill everyone because of it." "What, like the Stephen King book?" "No." Callows chuckled. "They told us it had latched itself on to everyone, all human subconsciousness. It had plans, something really, really awful. So the Foundation's plan was to wipe everyone out." "Wouldn't that include everyone who works for the Foundation?" "No, they, altered us, made it so we couldn't feel pain anymore." He paused and began giggling uncontrollably, as if he had just understood the punchline to a joke. "In fact," Callows said between fits of laughter, "that's probably how 999 was able to fix me." Next to him, Eliza couldn't help but laugh too. The humor was infectious. "Because you couldn't feel pain?" she giggled. "Yeah!"
Kalos exploded, delighted tears rolling down his face. I lost the capacity for it. I was hollowed out, and that would have made it easy for SCP-999 to fill that space with this. He rolled over onto the floor, still chortling unstoppably, and this didn't stop for hours. The Tickle Monster's powers of positivity had increased exponentially since it had found itself free from the Foundation facility it had used to live at. Much like Callow had explained to Eliza, it had allowed the lovable blob to correct the alteration the Foundation had made to the former MTF sergeant, allowing him to feel euphoria in the place of his total absence of all pain. And now, thanks to the influence of SCP-999, the threat posed by both the SCP Foundation and whatever this IT entity was seemed so far away, so irrelevant, and did little to dampen the high spirits of the survivors in the camp. But in their collective sense of bliss, Eliza, SCP-999, and the other survivors became a little oblivious to the outside world and its horrors. Little did they know, there was still danger lurking much closer than they realized, one that had spread from miles away and would very soon be at the settlement. It was Eliza and Callow that first discovered what was lurking nearby. They had both been searching for food in the ruins of the old town beyond the woods, which felt more and more like a completely different world the longer they spent in the camp with SCP-999. As Eliza rummaged through the storeroom of an abandoned supermarket, she heard a scream of agony coming from nearby. Callow. For the first time in months, panic, fear, and adrenaline rocked her system. It almost made her feel sick. She had been so overloaded with positive endorphins that it had practically numbed her to all other feelings. But instinct kicked in, fight or flight hitting her with the force of an ice-cold bucket of water, and she ran out into the store to look for Callow. What she saw gave her a terrified knot in her stomach, the kind she hadn't felt since the day the nightmare had started. The flesh that hates, an instance of SCP-610 was standing in the aisles of the empty supermarket. The sight of the grotesque mutated form shuffling towards her made Eliza freeze on the spot. It took a further moment to realize that Callow had long since stopped screaming. Eliza's thoughts had picked up speed. For the first time in months, she was processing information without it being dulled by the euphoria brought on by SCP-999. It made her realize that this SCP-610 had either killed Callow, and he'd soon be turning into one of those flesh creatures, or this was Callow, and he'd already changed. Thinking fast, Eliza sprinted through the supermarket, hearing the snarls of the flesh coming after her. She passed a shopping cart, and in an instant, grabbed its handlebar, turning the metal cage around and racing full force towards the SCP-610 instance chasing her. The cart collided with the blood-red mass of the flesh, the sheer force knocking the creature onto its back and giving Eliza a window of opportunity to race out of the supermarket, watched by a gaggle of mutated creatures. Those of them that still had eyes followed her movements as she ran back towards the woods, toward the camp, and slowly, the flesh that hates began to follow. From the moment that she returned to the settlement, SCP-999 could immediately sense that Eliza was in a state of panic. Instinctively, the creature glided up to her, only seeking to comfort her and make her forget about whatever had troubled her. "No! Stop!" she protested, as much as she wanted to not worry about the impending danger. SCP-999 recoiled from her, a wounded expression on its gooey orange face. "I'm sorry, it's just we're all in serious trouble," Eliza urged. The other survivors gathered around lazily, each of them seeming upbeat despite her grave news. "The flesh, SCP-610, they're here, they found us," she explained. "They killed Callow, and it won't take them long to find us." "They won't come here," one of the survivors replied, not argumentatively, but in a more uplifting and reassuring tone. "None of the other anomalies have found us in months," another interjected, smiling. "Not even the Foundation can get us here. We're protected. The Tickle Monster keeps us all safe." "But what if it can't protect us from the flesh?" Eliza desperately tried to warn her fellow survivors, but they were in too much of a carefree state to fear the approach of the flesh that hates. A number of them tried to convince her to relax, spend some time with the Tickle Monster so she wouldn't feel as bad. As appealing as that sounded, Eliza didn't want to let her guard down. She felt she owed SCP-999 for keeping her and the others alive, for helping them forget the horrific world the Foundation had unleashed. And even if she was the only one, she'd protect it. Night had fallen. The sound of every snapping twig felt like it could be one of the SCP-610s approaching. The rest of the camp was fast asleep,
save for Eliza, wielding a flaming branch in one hand to ward off the flesh. Sure enough, through the shadows of the woods and the low light of her torch, she saw shapes began to shuffle towards her. The slick, bloody creatures looked even worse in the dark, shambling over to Eliza, backing away cautiously as she brandished her flame. But the flesh that hates was closing in, more and more of them slithering out from between the trees, causing her to step back in the direction of the camp. Suddenly, an excitable orange mass swept past Eliza. Under the torchlight, she saw SCP-999 approaching the fleshy mutations. "No!" she cried out, horrified at what they would do to her camp's protector. To her surprise, the flesh stopped in their tracks as the tickle monster wriggled up to them. They seemed to get closer, examining the orange goop as it grinned at them. Then, as if they had lost their innate hostility to anything that they hadn't yet infected, the SCP-610 creatures turned and left. Perhaps it was something within the slimy substance the tickle monster was made of that repelled the flesh that hates. Or maybe it was because it was such a sheer force of overwhelming good, and its increased power, that allowed SCP-999 to pacify the monstrosities. Either way, Eliza breathed a sigh of relief. The grinning orange blob turned to her and smiled, leaping up into her arms and allowing her to carry it back to camp. As SCP-999 turned her relief into happiness once again, it seemed that no matter how bleak the world might be, even in a timeline as horrifying as that of SCP-5000, wherever the tickle monster goes, there will always be the promise of positivity, and with it, a sliver of hope from the friendliest anomaly of all.
Any changes today? The younger security officer Zach asked as he stepped into the watchtower.
"As if," replied his superior, a jaded, cynical old man who insisted on being referred to as Mr. Jefferson.
"The darn thing hasn't moved, spoken, or done so much as stretch one of those wings of his."
Another day at the office then,
Zach joked. Through the window, the pair of them looked through at the towering figure a few kilometers away. SCP-001, the Gate Guardian, stood motionless, its fiery sword in its hand, ever protecting its post at the precipice between our world and paradise. It had long been stationed at the entrance of a dimensional gateway that led to what was believed to be the Garden of Eden, described in the biblical Old Testament. Much like the security officers in the Foundation's base tasked with watching the Guardian, this was pretty much the extent of the day's activities.
Hey, did you see that news about the transfer posting? Zach asked, trying to stave off boredom with as much conversation he could squeeze out of his fellow officer.
"Yeah, I saw it."
Mr. Jefferson scoffed, rolling his eyes.
"What possesses someone like Robert Montauk to come down here?"
Must have wanted a quieter post,
Zach reasoned, looking out at the stillness of the Gate Guardian.
"Won't find one any quieter than here," Jefferson mused. "Him showing up will be the most exciting thing that's happened here in a long while."
Unbeknownst to both Zach and Mr. Jefferson, Dr. Robert Montauk would be only joining the team at the Gate Guardian observation site for a short while. Not one of them, nor anybody else within the Foundation, could ever guess Montauk's true intentions behind venturing there in the first place. He wanted an audience with the Gate Guardian itself. Approaching the colossal 1,000-foot-tall being, Dr. Montauk crossed the threshold of the minimum safe distance from the Guardian. Given the sheer heat of its weapon, hotter than Earth's sun, anything within a kilometer of SCP-001 was at risk of being obliterated, vaporized into atoms if they didn't turn back, which, through a voice that immediately rang out in Montauk's ears, the Gate Guardian commanded him to do.
Leave!
Its psychic message boomed.
Wait!
Dr. Montauk urged, holding up his hands in what would have been a futile defense against the Guardian's sword.
"I know what you do when people don't listen to your commands, but please, just give me a minute."
There was silence. SCP-001 didn't reply. There was nobody else close enough to hear Montauk speak to it. So, he continued.
"You are impossibly old. We know that much about you. And because of that, you must have seen things that we can't even begin to imagine, much less fully comprehend. But I've come a very long way to request that you impart some information to me, if you can."
He paused again, as if waiting for a reply that never came. The Gate Guardian merely stood in the same defensive, unwavering stance.
"Tell me, please, how much do you know about the Scarlet King?"
By this point in time, although the Foundation was yet to realize, Dr. Robert Montauk was slowly going insane.
His investigations into an anomalous entity known as the Scarlet King were gradually corrupting him, as he tried relentlessly to quantify exactly what this entity was and how great of a threat it posed. Little did Montauk realize that, in trying so hard to define and comprehend the being, he was inadvertently fueling its power. The Scarlet King was an interdimensional warmonger, an embodiment of hatred and chaos, and Dr. Robert Montauk was slowly falling under the King's influence. Upon hearing the tiny human figure utter his question, the immense Gate Guardian rebutted with another single-word psychic command, one it had never been recorded giving before.
Witness!
As if his increasing instability and the creeping influence of the Scarlet King hadn't made Montauk feel bad enough, he instantly felt sick. There was a searing pain behind his eyes, like he was staring directly at the sun, accompanied by a nausea that made his head spin. It took a moment of enduring the horrific sensation before he realized what was happening. The Guardian was trying to show him something. Rather than give any information on the Scarlet King verbally, SCP-001 was imparting a psychic vision onto Montauk, a memory of events long past, the answers he sought, a warning, or perhaps all three. The vision showed Montauk a time so long ago that it couldn't ever be forgotten, for there was barely anyone alive to remember it in the first place. It was eons in the past, long before the comparatively recent dawn of humanity, a time only spoken of in the Dust and Blood Tablet, an artifact of the Davite civilization, some of the earliest worshippers of the Scarlet King himself. And there, marching up to the entrance of Eden, was the crimson-clad eldritch abomination and a horde of horrors with him. According to the story recorded in the Dust and Blood Tablet, this would have been much earlier in the life of the Scarlet King, perhaps even before he assumed his now infamous title. Back then, he would most likely have been known as his original name of Kanthrak, one of multiple siblings born when the Tree of Life was planted, and thus created all life in the multiverse. But, being the only one of his siblings cursed with awareness, knowing the pain his existence brought him, Kanthrak would eventually set out on his lifelong mission to destroy all of existence across every dimension. And he started by killing his siblings, consuming them to claim their power for himself. Around this time in prehistory, the being that would one day become known as Scarlet King didn't quite possess the power that he would several millennia later. Although that's not to say he was an unformidable force of destruction, fueled by his singular hatred for existence. His vow to destroy extended to the Tree of Life that had caused him to be, along with the tree's creator and all of their creation. In other words, everything in the multiverse, all of creation, if you will. So what was the Scarlet King doing there so long ago, at the dimensional doorway protected by the Gate Guardian? Well, beyond the boundary, between it and the rest of the infinite multiverse, lay the supposed Garden of Eden. While it is unknown if it is in fact the same Eden referred to in the Book of Genesis is up for debate, especially among the Foundation. But at a glance, even through the gate, it certainly does look like a paradise. The space is filled with lush vegetation of astronomical size, populated by a number of beings that seem to resemble the Gate Guardian itself. And there, protected by its watchful caretaker, are two trees. One is thought to be the Tree of Knowledge, that Eve was tricked into eating an apple from during the Book of Genesis. The other, however, bears an unknown type of fruit, and is widely believed to be the Tree of Life. Now, back in the modern age, there's never been a conclusive link between the Tree of Life mentioned by the Davites and their barbaric civilization's legends regarding the creation of the Scarlet King. But the fact that so long ago he and his most feared generals were bearing down on the Gate Guardian's position, defending a garden where there was known to be a tree of that description, well, it all seems rather conclusive now. Alongside Kanthrak were 6 of his 7 daughters, each one of them a fearsome abomination much like their destructive father. As they approached, not one needed to exchange any words with their angelic protector of Eden. The Gate Guardian knew what these monsters were here for. They would stop at nothing to pass through his gate and uproot the Tree of Life, the progenitor of all living beings in all of existence. Even though it was early in Kanhrak's career as the rampaging interdimensional warlord he so is, he was as steadfast as ever in his goal to annihilate every corner of creation, every dimension, every parallel plane of reality, every single pocket of existence across infinity. They'd all come undone if he burned the Tree of Life, pulled it out at the roots, and splintered it until nothing remained. To the once and future Scarlet King, that the same tree had led to his own tortured existence. It was the source of his suffering, and it had to be destroyed. The only thing standing in his way was a figure as colossal as Kanhrak himself, wielding a flaming sword.
Leave!
Boomed the psychic voice of the Gate Guardian. It was like a doorman standing before a group of rowdy teenagers trying to force their way into a movie theater. Except these rowdy teens were the Scarlet King, his horrifying daughters, and the forces he had already amassed since his creation. The Horde stood ready, waiting for the commands of their king, who they thought would gladly lead the charge as they marched on the Garden of Eden to begin the destruction of existence. But that's not what happened. Usually, the Scarlet King would never shy away from a fight, preferring to lead the charge when it came to a slaughter. Instead, he commanded his first daughter, Ativik, to commence the first attack on the protector who stood in their path. On her foul father's word, Ativik took her horde and charged at the Guardian. What she and her forces lacked in numerical advantage, Ativik more than made up for in her knowledge of war. She hungered for it, sought dominion. That was her seal, after all. And yet, in the face of this impending onslaught, the Gate Guardian remained still, rooted to the same spot it had as always, and would always be standing in. A number of Ativik's minions burst into flames, the very fabric of their crude form separated on a molecular level as they were effortlessly rendered into nothingness. Still, the Gate Guardian hadn't appeared to move an inch, had exerted no energy, despite the damage it had done to Ativik and her forces in defense of Eden. As his first daughter screeched and howled in despair at the decimation of her horde, her children, the Scarlet King decided he needed to better understand his opponent. With a wave of his clawed crimson hand, the king commanded his next daughter, Aghor, to send forth her own army. In a tidal wave of nightmarish creatures, Aghor sent her horrific children into battle. She possessed a far greater quantity to do battle on her father's behalf. Perhaps Aghor even believed that was the Scarlet King's plan. With a greater number of her forces over her sisters, maybe she would be able to overwhelm the Guardian. But even as her own children began to be vaporized the closer that they got to the gate, Aghor had no idea she was little more than a pawn, being sacrificed so that Kanhrak could learn more about his imposing angelic enemy. Another of the Scarlet King's daughters, a being known as Anhwip, was the next called up to contribute to the unfolding battle. Although to call it a battle undersells just how easily the Gate Guardian seemed to be eliminating the oncoming forces without even moving. While an outwardly frail-seeming creature, Anhuit's primary strength over her sisters was a proficiency in magic, her innate ability to warp and reshape reality around her. It was that power that had caused her father to be wary of her, viewing Anhuit's abilities as a threat to his leadership. And so Kanhrak had her crippled and all her children, leaving them unable to overthrow him, but still loyal to their king. Obeying her father's command, perhaps out of the same loyalty or fear that he would harm her and her children further if she disobeyed, Anhuit unfurled her magic. She reshaped the world around them, making it so that the passage of time moved so much slower. And that was what revealed to the Scarlet King his enemy's greatest strength in combat. The Gate Guardian had so far been able to obliterate both Ativik and now Aghor's forces without seeming to move, but it wasn't by standing still. It was moving, just much faster than the blink of Scarlet King's multiple eyes. Now that Anhuit's magic had slowed the passage of time, the Gate Guardian could be seen doing battle. As Aghor's atrocities spilled towards the angel to try and overwhelm it, it effortlessly blocked the oncoming attacks with its sword. Everything the flaming blade connected with instantly evaporated, bursting into atoms as they were practically cleaved out of existence by the Gate Guardian's mighty weapon. Even with time slowed to a crawl, the towering winged protector of Eden only appeared to be moving at an average speed. But when time flowed normally, without Anhuit manipulating reality, the Guardian was simply too fast to be observed. Resisting the urge to dive headfirst into the fight himself, The Scarlet King knew it would likely lead to his untimely demise. He refused to accept that. It could not happen, but he still had yet to amass the strength he would need as he continued his ascent. So while time was slowed to a crawl and the Gate Guardian was still engaged in combat with Aghor's forces, he turned to another of his remaining daughters, Adista. If the Scarlet King and his forces couldn't get past the Guardian, they could still try to get to the Tree of Life while the Protector's focus was diverted. Adista unleashed a wave of pestilence, sickness, and disease spewing from her in a cloud of vapor, heading straight towards the Angelic Garden and Eden's entrance beyond. The Scarlet King knew this latest attack wouldn't phase or weaken the Gate Guardian. He hoped the foul smog would instead pass through the gateway itself into the garden. As Adista sent forth her power, blood and ash soaked the landscape around them. All the plants outside the entrance to Eden withered and died, shriveling and decomposing as the disgusting fog rolled towards the gate. It washed over the Guardian, whose form only seemed to glow brighter as he repelled the pestilence. It was as if it didn't even need to think about it, still focused on finishing off the rest of the oncoming army. As its glow intensified, so did the fiery sword that the Gate Guardian swung with ease and finesse. Flames burst from the blade, the encroaching fumes catching fire, along with the air itself. It ignited in a wave of fire, a defensive inferno that repelled this latest attack. But for a brief few moments, while time stayed slow, before Anhuit's hold on reality inevitably broke, the king had sent forth Atilif. Of all his spawn, she was the most reserved, keeping mostly to herself, never speaking. She and her children could change their faces and forms, shift into anything or anyone, and walk undetected through the multiverse. And now her father was employing her incredible stealth abilities to slip behind enemy lines, while the Gate Guardian was finishing off the remaining onslaught from Kanhrak's other daughters. It was as Atilif drew near, creeping unseen closer and closer to the entrance, keeping the Scarlet King out of Eden, that the Guardian seemed to pause. It slowly, ominously turned its huge head, tilting until it was looking directly at Atilif. If its expression could be seen, maybe the Gate Guardian would almost be impressed that someone was able to sneak past it. After all, it was a feat that no other being in creation could ever hope to accomplish. But then again, with its steadfast conviction and dedication to its protective duty, maybe it would have looked upon Atilif with anger. With a cleaving swing of its scorching sword, the Gate Guardian unfurled a tidal wave of fire that engulfed everything around it. Not just Atilif, but Ativik, Aghor, and Adista. All the king's daughters that had attacked so far, along with every one of their own children, were instantly obliterated. They were all reduced to empty, vacant spaces where they had once been, their atoms separated by the searing swing of the Guardian's weapon. The devastating blow by his adversary did little to deter the Scarlet King from his mission. He was still set on destroying the Tree of Life, and no loss was too great in his pursuit of destroying existence. He barely cared that 4 of his own daughters had just been unmade by the Guardian. Anhuit was still there, clinging on to time as if it were a thrashing animal. The Scarlet King could simply make her restore her fallen sisters and their forces. He had lost nothing, but had held back for too long, and slowly drew his own weapon out of thin air. Wielding a sword that was as blood-soaked as the Guardian's was hot, the Scarlet King locked blades with the one being standing in their way. Both the ancient angelic defender and the attacking eldritch abomination were evenly matched. Every one of their vicious strikes against the other met with an equally strong parry. A weapon of extreme, all-consuming heat blocked swipes from a sharp, serrated edge that matched the deep red that would be forever synonymous with Kanhrak. The force of their 2 swords clashing and striking each other was so great that it rippled out from their one-on-one fight. The landscape around them was flattened, wiped clean of any remaining plant life that hadn't already been destroyed by the forces of the king's daughters. Despite having acquired nowhere near the power he would thousands of years after this fight, the Scarlet King was still a formidable force in single combat, and yet the Gate Guardian seemed incapable of tiring or weakening, still standing strong against the onslaught. Even after wiping multiple armies out with its flaming sword, the Guardian was still able to hold its own against the Scarlet King, who was furious. Enraged at being so close to the Tree of Life, yet unable to get past his angelic adversary, he'd need to be stronger, faster, even more ruthless than the warlord he already was. Despite Anhuit slowing down time, the king and the guardian were at a stalemate. Time. That was it. The Scarlet King needed more time. Withdrawing from the fight, he realized that this was a battle that could not be won by sheer brute force alone. His mission to destroy all creation, to get to the Tree of Life, would take cunning, deception, and more time. If he let it, the Gate Guardian could easily kill Kamprak. Its flaming weapon could cleave him out of existence, and that would end the king's torment. But it wouldn't be enough. A death would be unsatisfying, knowing that the rest of existence would go on after he was gone. The Scarlet King couldn't accept that. It wasn't enough. So he did the one thing nobody would expect of him. He made a deal with the Gate Guardian. It was an action still fueled by his infinite hatred for all existence, his yearning for total chaos. The Scarlet King knew that one day, an event would arrive where the Guardian and the other beings like it in the Garden of Eden would spill forth and deliver judgment on this world. And when that rapture happened, the Tree of Life would be undefended. The Scarlet King bartered with the Guardian that he would retreat for the time being, so he could spend eons amassing more and more power. Then, when the fateful day arrived, the Gate Guardian would allow him into Eden to destroy the Tree of Life, while it and its brethren were busy conducting the rapture. Halting their fight, the Scarlet King offered a crimson claw to the Gate Guardian's burning hand. Returning to reality from the intense vision, still feeling sick at what he had witnessed, Robert Montauk looked up at the still, silent form of the Gate Guardian.
Did you do it?
He yelled, desperate to know more through his obsession with the Scarlet King.
Did you tell him yes? Did you make a deal?
There was no answer from the Guardian, just a single word that echoed through Montauk's fractured mind.
Leave!
The air is filled with chaos as the Foundation Mobile Task Force agent is violently hurled into the sky. His blood-curdling screams echo as he slams into the spinning blades of a Foundation attack helicopter. It's a visceral collision, sending crimson blobs into the wind. He is killed on contact. The chopper lurches as it pirouettes out of the sky and smashes into the side of a nearby skyscraper with a thunderous explosion. On the streets below, Foundation troops mount a desperate resistance. Hammer Down fights shoulder to shoulder with members of the conventional armed forces, the National Guard, and any street cops brave enough to risk their lives. Their armor glistens under the lights of a burning city, their heavy weaponry ranging from assault rifles to snipers to rocket launchers. Behind them, tanks and ATVs stocked with heavy machine guns roll forward. The death toll is already in the thousands. If this situation isn't under control soon, they're sure to spill into the tens and hundreds of thousands, and eventually, the millions. The soldiers concentrated their fire, but it's not against a rival army, but a lone figure who steps out of the fire and the brick dust. It is dressed in a long black cloak, standing 9 feet tall on its hind legs. To the untrained eye, it looks eerily like SCP-096. But there is something different about it. It seems taller, stronger. It stands erect, its face no longer covered and frightened, but coldly determined. As it surveys the attackers sent to subdue it, it does something that the original SCP-096 has never done. Its mouth twists into a sadistic smile. The army unleashes a white-hot barrage. Explosions, armor-piercing rounds, and in some more humane cases, tranquilizer darts burst through the sky. Once the opening salvo runs dry, they wait with bated breath. Nothing could withstand that, surely. But they're wrong. When the dust clears, it's still standing there, seemingly without a scratch. The only thing that is different is that it now has a few extra holes in its cloak. "Well, well, well," it says in a calm, deep voice. "Quite the welcoming party you've amassed. Allow me to repay your gratitude in kind." What happens is over in a few moments. The monster rears up and swoops in at impossible speeds, its long arms extended. It weaves through the amassed forces who, in their panic, turn their weapons on each other. The monster's huge claws slice through the soldiers who've laid their lives and bodies on the line to stop its advance. Soon, blood covers the rubble. With a deafening roar, the monster tears the tank's turret apart like paper, revealing the terrified soldiers cowering within. Blood splatters across the cold steel as the monster straightens, towering over the mangled machine. He adjusts his tattered, blood-soaked cloak with a chilling calm.
To think I ever feared the gaze of these dullards,
he said with a tut.
Soon they'll learn to fear my face for a different reason, for I am the new god of their world.
Something flutters down from above in the air, otherwise choked with dust and embers. A piece of paper, shiny and slick. A Polaroid photograph. The monster clasps it in surprisingly delicate fingers and inspects it. In the photo, he sees a face that he hasn't seen in a long, long time. That's when he hears a familiar sound, one that has played in his mind for a number of years. He turns with another wry smile to see the ultimate enemy standing only about 20 feet away.
"Hello, old friend," the monster says. "Have you come here to die?"
Just 24 hours earlier, when many who are now dead still had seemingly long and happy lives ahead of them, a Chaos Insurgency infiltration plot was on its way to ruining everything. Like many groups of interest, the Chaos Insurgency can often seem mysterious and inscrutable. Once loyal to the SCP Foundation, the Chaos Insurgency's ranks are now filled with ex-members of its most elite mobile task force, the Red Right Hand. These defectors are more than just skilled combatants. They are walking arsenals of tactical brilliance and insider knowledge, wielding the Foundation's own secrets as their deadliest weapon. No enemy understands the Foundation's intricate systems, hidden protocols, and weaknesses better than they do. Some of them use this knowledge to serve Chaos itself, making the world a less stable place. Others have a far more simple motivation: money. They abduct anomalies from Foundation containment sites in highly organized raids. The anomalies that are most easy to weaponize are sold on to regimes of dictators in the developing world, eager for a way to maintain their power. For a while, an anomaly that the Chaos Insurgency was extremely eager to add to their catalog was SCP-096, the Shy Guy. There were a number of advantages to SCP-096 as a weapon. It's almost indestructible. It isn't sentient enough to resist orders. It has an almost 100% success rate in killing its targets. But there's also a lot of risk involved. Anyone who sees its face is inevitably killed, including those who deployed it if they happen to see its face by mistake. The Chaos Insurgency has decided to make their move and secure SCP-096 for a major sale, but it needed some preparation first. Their plan was simple: infiltrate Site-19, obtain SCP-096, and then transport it to SCP-914, the Clockworks, where it could be refined to become an even more effective weapon. They had no idea of the true horrors that this plan would unleash. To a point, the plan was surgical. Chaos Insurgency agents infiltrated the base, executing any guards and researchers who dared stand in their way. Soon enough, they found their way to the secure chamber where SCP-096 was being held. They engaged in a brief firefight with the guards stationed around the anomaly, but their superior tactics and weapons won out, leaving them alone with the monster. The fact is, the Chaos Insurgency is almost as good as freeing anomalies from containment as the Foundation is at containing them. Their agents brought special diamond-tipped saws that allowed them to easily carve through the metal walls of the cube eternally welded around SCP-096. They averted their eyes and threw a bag over the monster's head, leading it out of the chamber with a rope around its neck. Across the facility, other Chaos Insurgency agents have already secured SCP-914. They've put in signal jammers and organized a decoy attack on another far-flung containment site, just to ensure that reaction time from external reinforcements would be as delayed as possible. It wasn't before long that they were ushering in SCP-096 into the intake booth of SCP-914, while one of the more senior members of the raiding party stood at the control panel. The plan was simple: set the machine to fine and have a refined version of the Shy Guy that any self-respecting autocratic despot would want to add to their arsenal. However, the Chaos Insurgency raiding party had made a fatal mistake, underestimating the SCP Foundation. A group of guards had survived the initial assault and were building their numbers outside the testing chamber. Just as the Chaos Insurgency squad leader was about to activate the machine, the guards breached the room and opened fire. The squad leader took 2 bullets through the lung and another through his spine. He collapsed against the console, bleeding out, and in the process knocked the dial. The setting went from fine to very fine, a crucial difference that would lead to a horrifying fate for many. The machine juddered into life, a cacophony of mechanical noise. Once it's already started, it is impossible to stop. As the firefight continued, all they could do was hope that the worst-case scenario would be averted for all of them. Once the process was over and the horrifying noise of the machinery cut out, the door to the output booth slid open with a billowing cloud of mist. All the gunfire stopped as combatants from both sides turned their heads to see the immense beast stepping out of the dark. It was SCP-096 in vague shape. It looked bigger, stronger, smarter, and it didn't look like a loping, mindless beast the way the shy guy they knew often did. No, it walked erect on its back legs, implying a kind of sickly intelligence that its former incarnation never possessed. And as if attempting to prove that in the most shocking way possible, the monster that had once been SCP-096 cleared its throat and spoke.
"You must teach me how to use that wonderful machine," he said. "I can safely say that I've never felt better."
There was a moment of hesitation from the sheer shock. The creature could talk? It didn't seem to be entering its rage state from having its face viewed either. It was, though, on some deep fundamental level, SCP-096 had been well and truly altered. But that doesn't mean it's been altered for the better. What followed next is a wholesale slaughter unlike anything seen since the acid-spitting Zero, as the monstrous new form of SCP-096 murdered the Foundation guards and Chaos Insurgents alike. Not because it had to, no. Not because it was driven by murderous rage, but because it wanted to. How many decades had they kept him locked up, isolated, to stew in his rage and self-loathing? None of these sad little humans had ever tried to help him or ever tried to cure him. Just futile attempts to lock him up and kill him. Cold, not cruel. What a sad little joke. Now that he had full power over his mind, he would show them the true meaning of cruel. It didn't take the monster long to decimate the containment site and break into a nearby population center. He started to wreak havoc for his fun, his own sick amusement. Elsewhere, a Foundation panic room was desperately trying to figure out a solution. Mobile task forces were being dispatched left and right, while potential anomalous solutions were being considered. Releasing SCP-682 would be too much of a risk, given that even an unenhanced version of SCP-096 fought the hard-to-destroy reptile to a draw. Abel and Pandora's Box would likely be just as vulnerable to the monster's attacks as any other human would. Perhaps their only option would be to fight fire with fire, and they'd need to take advantage of some of the Foundation's dimensional shifting technology to do it. An agent was sent on a mission to an alternate universe, hoping to collect a special package, their version of SCP-096. And so the two Titans face one another in the ruined streets of the city. The original SCP-096, extracted as a last resort from another universe, up against the new and improved SCP-096 that the Clockworks had produced. Whoever was left standing would decide the fate of the human race. The first 096, who, for the sake of simplicity, we'll just call the original, charges for the monster, all its speed and strength and fury channeled into one hellish thrust. But the monster is intelligent and does not feel the fear that others do. The monster dodges the full force of the original's charge, grabbing its legs and swinging it into a nearby building. A thunderous boom echoes around the scarred city as a cascade of broken bricks tumble down, but that only buys him a few seconds. The original is a creature driven by pure instinct, untiring, unrelenting. It's already charging back into battle with a bone-chilling scream even before the dust settles. It comes out swinging, displaying its impossible strength for its lithe build. The monster catches it by its wrists and holds it in place as best it can, exerting force that pushes it down to the ground. My, I was a persistent one, wasn't I? He says, but so very stupid. He hears a rumbling down below. The monster raises a fist and brings it down onto the back of the original. The mindless beast is mashing through the ground, passing down through the sewer system and into the subway below. As the original hits the tracks, momentarily dazed, it turns to see a bright light coming towards it, and then it's hit by the 6 p.m. eastbound train. Up above, the monster laughs. Was this really the Foundation's trump card? Taking him on with an inferior version of himself? How incredibly pathetic. If this was really the best resistance they could put up after trying everything else, then his dominion over this world was assured. Or was it? Consumed by visions of a world reshaped in its grotesque image, the monster doesn't notice the tremors beneath its feet until it's too late. The ground explodes with a deafening roar as the original bursts through the concrete. The impact sends the monster hurtling through the air, smashing it into the crumbling remains of a nearby building, the very one marked by the wreckage of a helicopter crash. A flicker of recognition flashes across the monster's warped features, and its cruel grin returns. It does not see rubble. It sees an opportunity. As the original readies itself for another attack, the monster decides to give itself an advantage. It reaches for the nearby destroyed helicopter and rips off one of the reinforced propeller blades, wielding it like an improvised sword. When the original inevitably came bounding in, the monster slashed at it, cleaving a deep gash across the original's gray flesh. The original screamed in pain, but the monster didn't let up, striking again and again with the propeller sword. Still, the original's bones remained impervious to every strike. Then the monster would have to try a little harder to break them. He impales the panicking original with the sword, then goes in with his claws and fists, striking relentlessly at the creature's head. When the original falls, the monster grabs it on either side of the head and begins to squeeze. If the bones break, then it's all over. However, as the monster has the original in its grip, he doesn't even notice the blue sparks of energy crackling around them both. He's so engrossed in this ultimate act of self-destruction that he doesn't notice the trap he's fallen into. The same technology that brought the original SCP-096 here from a different universe could send them both of them back there. By the time the monster fully realizes the orb of electricity crackling around them, it's already too late.
No! You can't do this!
He doesn't get to finish his sentence. In a flash, the two of them are gone, to a different place, a different time. But wherever that may be, one thing is sure. This isn't over. Now go check out SCP-096 is not a monster, and SCP-096 but the roles are reversed for more.